Hello and welcome to the Little Knowledge Podcast, where myself, Paul Busby, and Goff Morgan have a chat about various historic properties. I think it's safe to say we've been having a chat about this particular property for quite some time. In fact, this is, as Goff said last time, the fourth part of our Tredegar House trilogy.
Yeah.
How are you, Goff? Well, I know how you are. I know how you are, and it's not
Oh yeah.
good.
No. Greetings, everybody. I'm
Mm.
poorly. I fell over and hurt my knee, so I'm sitting here with a big fat balloon knee with lots of bruising on it, and feeling slightly sorry for myself, but not enough to dampen the thrill of a podcast. Let's be fair.
Well,
Yeah.
you
No.
know, the difference
I
is,
don't.
though,
What?
I mean, the difference is, and this is a good thing, that you are not yet at the stage, you've fallen.
Yeah.
You're not at the stage yet where you've had a fall.
Adam. Yeah. Yeah. He's had a fall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've not
Never nice when they
reacted.
say that.
No, I have fell over. I'll show you my bruise as a treat for Christmas. There you are. Look at my.
Ah, dear. Well, that's
Oh,
turned them off
thank you.
straight away. You know what?
Yeah. Good night, everybody.
We had a review of this podcast. I was talking to a
You've
friend of
had a
mine.
what?
We had a kind of an unofficial review of the podcast. A mate of mine is a proper podcaster.
Oh,
You know,
blimey.
editing, it's slick. And
Oh.
I saw one of his podcasts and I said, "Oh, this is like a liner, you know, this is smooth, everything's
Yeah.
doing its job. You've got an editor, you've got everything else." And he said, "Yeah, but when you and Goff do a podcast, it's a wonderful pirate ship of a chaotic podcast." And I like that. The
Yeah.
pirate ship of local history podcast. Anything could happen,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially this time.
Yeah.
So shall we get started? Because we've got so much to do.
We do have it's the big out for 2023, this one, folks.
Yeah, buckle in, everybody.
Yeah. So
It's
remember, you can always pop in and pop out. You're not obliged to sit here with teeth gritted the entire way through.
No, don't
Yay!
be a hero, don't be a martyr. Pop in and out. You'll always find us. And we start with, well, how we ended last time, right?
Yeah.
It was 1913, a grand old man, be Gladstonian for a minute, the grand old man of southeast Wales, Godfrey, Viscount Tredegar, died.
Yep.
And there he is, looking as if he's just told a mischievous joke.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, that means that he didn't have any kids, so the Viscountcy died with him, but the barony lived on. So the third Lord Tredegar was his nephew, Courtney Morgan, who we'll see in a little while. But what did Courtney Morgan actually inherit? Well, in 1919, he was dragged up before the Coal Commission, which was run by a man called Lord Sankey, who was from Cardiff, to keep it local. And as Goff has mentioned on an earlier podcast, Courtney, how did he put his lands, Goff? What three
He said
segments
they
did he put his
divided
land?
them into three types. The land they owned into three types: land they bought, land they'd inherited, and land that they'd owned prior to 1066.
That's a tax dodge if ever I've heard
Yeah.
one. How did you get that land? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. It was prior to 1066. We can't
Yeah.
possibly have the
Yeah.
reasons for that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
absolutely
that
right.
is pretty astonishing, though, isn't it, really, to say that?
And in 1919, Courtney was told to basically state the only Welsh lands of the Tredegar estate which might have mineral wealth. And Courtney declared that he owned 43,000 acres of Breconshire, 32,000 acres of Monmouthshire, and 7,000 acres of Glamorgan. That's 82,000 acres in 1919,
Cool.
many of which had mineral wealth. The Cardiff lands were particularly valuable for ground rents. I mean, the Tredegar estate in Cardiff is essentially Splot, Roath, and Adamsdown, that sort of area.
Oh, right, yeah.
And there's Tredegarville to this
Yeah.
day. Pengham Farm is my favourite bit that they owned. Pengham Moors, because it became the airport for this area.
Oh, right.
Roos, there was
Yeah.
Pengham Municipal Airport. It became
Oh,
RAF Pengham in later
blimey.
years. And that was all on Tredegar land.
Gosh.
And that was only built there because Courtney, the new Lord Tredegar, agreed to sell it to them.
Oh, Lord.
So I find that quite interesting. And in fact, that does play into his funeral. So if I forget the funeral bit, Goff, remind me that Pengham and the aerodrome figures into
Okay.
Courtney Tredegar's funeral. But there were also lands in Herefordshire. There are a little bit of lands in Norfolk, a little bit in Scotland, and also London. The ground rents of their properties, this is what Courtney's inheriting, in Bow and the East End of London were very valuable. And in fact, if we have a little look, this is Tredegar Square you see today in London. This was
Oh, yeah.
actually, this elegant square was actually set up by Sir Charles Morgan back in the 1830s, who we talk about in what, part 2? Was it part 3? I forget.
Part 3.
Part 3 was Sir Charles, so he set
Yeah.
up this. And on the Lichfield Road, you've still got a pub called
Oh,
the
yeah.
Lord Tredegar.
Yeah.
And because it was set up in the 1890s, you can't quite see it, but this is Godfrey hanging up there.
Oh, right. Oh,
At
yeah.
least it used to be.
In the younger. Yeah.
I'm looking disapproving at you now, the Lord Tredegar of Lichfield Road. There's nothing Tredegar-y inside the pub. That's their prerogative. But they've replaced Godfrey these days with this generic pub sign here. Utterly charmless.
Yes.
Come on, Lord Tredegar.
Buck up.
Buck up.
Buck up.
Yeah, so they own quite a bit in that area. The Morgan Arms is round the corner. Unless the Lord Tredegar change that sign pretty quick, I think you should go to the Morgan Arms.
Yeah, right.
We're going to be sued by the Lord Tredegar.
Probably instantly. Yeah, bad review for the sign.
Very sensitive about Welsh history being ignored.
The interesting thing as well is that it's not referred to. They're not called Tredegar, are they? In the East End, they're called Tredegar.
Tredegar, well, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the Lord Tredegar, and the square is referred to as Tredegar Square because they've lost the pronunciation.
Damn shame.
Well, to me, I'm always of the opinion that the place is what it's called by the people who live there.
Yes, but the name
is
is
Tredegar
not.
Square.
Tredegar Square is absolutely fine, but there was no Lord Tredegar.
Oh no, there was no Lord Tredegar. There was a Lord Tredegar. Yeah, and I'll give you that one.
Hooray!
Hey!
Small victory. So this is our new Lord Tredegar. Here he is.
Courtney, love his tiny
Courtney
heart.
Morgan. Now, Goff, his personality. What sort of personality did Courtney Morgan have? This new Lord Tredegar, in your opinion? You know quite a bit about him.
Oh, it's rather complicated because he's a different man at different stages of his life. When he took over at this period, it wants to be essentially the archetypal Edwardian gentleman
with moustache.
With the moustache, he wants the house. He thought that the house under Godfrey was run far too casually, so he tried to set up more anglicized systems of relationships with the servants. Things became a lot more formalized, a lot more distant. Things was a lot more regulated. He'd had a military background as well, so he wanted to do things properly. He wanted to be a respectable, dyed-in-the-wool Edwardian gent and live the lifestyle of a leisurely Edwardian gentleman as well. Hunting, shooting, fishing, sailing. He didn't have any real interest in the agricultural, the industrial and commercial uses of the estate, but he still had this concept of noblesse oblige. So he carried on a lot of the charitable giving of his great uncle as well, seeing that that's the sort of thing. But that's not the man he winds up as. So when we come to the man he
we'll come to that.
You
mentioned charitable giving, so we'll get that out the way already. You're quite right. I mean, he was the man who gave Newport Castle to the corporation.
Yeah.
Or most of it. It's an odd position where bits of the castle were owned by different people. But Lord Tredegar bought essentially most of Newport Castle from the Duke of Beaufort. Courtney inherited it from Godfrey. And yet he gave it to the corporation only if it wasn't used for commercial ventures. Because it had been a brewery.
That's it had been a brewery, yeah. So it couldn't be used for commercial purposes, yeah.
Kevin Mabley House. We have a whole podcast on Kevin Mabley House, don't we?
Yeah.
He bought it essentially because it was attached to his Rupera estate lands. And so he let it from a peppercorn rent become a TB hospital. There's the Friars, former home of Thomas Prothero and Octavius Morgan, stars of other podcasts, which he gave as a tribute to his uncle Godfrey. And also the Deer Park, which is now the Tredegar Park recreational ground in Newport, the 70 acres of his old Deer Park. He gave that as well. In fact, he gave quite a lot away, £5,000 here to the University of Wales, £10,000 here. So you're quite right.
Remember, we're talking that those sums are astronomical for the time period. Those aren't small sums now.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
No, they're a large, healthy amount of money to pass over to somebody.
That's right.
The
And he
equivalent of probably
married.
millions.
He married
Ah,
this lady. He married well. He married Lady Katherine Carnegie, who was the daughter of the ninth Earl of South Esk. And again, marrying an earl's daughter. Lady Catherine was more artistic. She liked music and poetry. And according to her son, she had the most hideous taste in furniture. She was into the vorticist art movement.
oh yes,
So
yeah,
with
yeah. But this
hunting,
is
shooting, fishing, Courtney and his wife being artistic and musical, ultimately the marriage became doomed.
mm,
And Catherine became very ill, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But we have our new Lord and Lady Tredegar. Catherine, at this stage, really didn't want to come to Tredegar House very often at all. And
oh
here is
right.
Tredegar House. I do
Um,
like to think, actually, that, oh, by the way, we will one day do a podcast on the architecture of Tredegar House, because even today there is research going on. I mean, it's all
yeah.
very interesting. And even there could well be a podcast of Beyond the Green Bay's Door, where we look at it through the servant's eyes. I mean,
Mm,
this is the subject that keeps on giving, really.
mm.
Well, I like to think that Courtney inherited this huge estate, as he stated himself, 82,000 acres. The problem is he also inherited the first serious imposition of death duties.
Ah, yes,
Enormous.
yeah.
And to put it into perspective, when Godfrey died in 1913, and this is a conservative estimate, they needed to find cash, and cash in our money of, and this is conservative, over 60 million pounds. Now, when
Good
most of
Lord.
your money is tied up
Yeah,
in the land, because you were
yeah,
charged by how much land you owned, and the Tredegar estate was probably the largest estate we've talked about on these
yeah,
podcasts, you have to sell land in order to pay the death duties.
yeah,
So Courtney was forced to sell in a lot of the Breckenshire land at this stage to get the cash by a deadline to pay the death duties.
yeah.
Death duties was the angel of death hovering over aristocratic families in the 20th century.
Yes.
But that did not seem to curtail Courtney's spending.
No. Well,
Uh,
he still had a huge amount even after the death.
Massive,
I mean, this is the
massive.
thing about we talk about again the extent of that amount of money, but the thing is they could actually afford that
Mm, mm.
and still live an incredibly extravagant lifestyle. I mean, we don't realize, I think, in effect, how incredibly rich these people were. They were actually plutocrats in their day. They're up there with billionaire status. Really, they're not
Yeah,
millionaires at all. They were multimillionaires. You know.
yeah, absolutely. But I like to think of Courtney as a man with all the money in the world, but no sense of timing. He
Yeah.
loved yachting, as you mentioned earlier on, and he had a succession of steam yachts. But he bought the largest yacht of the Royal Yacht Squadron, the seventh largest private yacht on the planet, and one of the greatest yachts on
Mm.
the planet. And he bought it in 1914.
Yes. Yeah.
Isn't she gorgeous? It's
The
Liberty.
Liberty. Yeah, the Liberty.
And Liberty weighed in at 1,600 tons. It cost $1.5 million to create it in 1908, and that was
Mm.
Joseph Pulitzer of the Pulitzer
Ah,
Prize, the great
Pulitzer.
media mogul in
Yeah.
America, who built it to his own specified standards. It was supposed to have decks which minimized seasickness, whether that worked or not, but
Oh,
also made it as quiet as humanly possible. There weren't many steps. It was all ramps and curves. And
yeah.
this was a beautiful vessel. She was 268 feet in length. And Courtney bought her in 1914.
Mm.
And there she is, one of the great yachts. Oh, by the way, called Liberty, because although the French gave the Statue of Liberty to the Americans, there wasn't actually anywhere to put it.
Oh,
And so Pulitzer raised money through his New York World newspaper for the current pedestal that Lady Liberty
oh, right.
stands on in the harbor. So he
Yeah.
named his
Oh,
yacht after
yeah.
the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, interesting.
And she's a gorgeous vessel.
Yeah.
Um, and also, by the way, Courtney had a Master Mariner's license. So, I mean, same with his cars. I mean,
Yeah.
he knew he could take apart an engine.
Oh,
He had a
gosh.
chauffeur. He was
Yeah.
a Master Mariner.
Yeah.
But he often had a captain, so he could just relax.
Yeah.
Courtney was actually someone who liked to do things, or liked to know he could do things for himself.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it?
This is gorgeous. Look at that.
Oh, look at that.
Liberty steaming
Yeah.
through a Newport landmark.
Under the transporter bridge. Oh,
Underneath it, Courtney
oh,
got involved in the RNVR, the Royal Naval Volunteer
yeah.
Reserve, otherwise known as the Wavy Navy.
Yeah.
And at this time, he was a commander in that.
Yeah.
And I know. Do you remember Isabel Straw, Goff?
Yes.
Wife of Frank Straw. They were high up in the Friends of Tredegar House, and lovely, lovely, lovely couple. And Isabel told me she knew someone who'd been interviewed by Courtney on Liberty in Newport to become an officer for the RNVR.
Oh
And he
gosh.
said, as I was sat there, it was really odd. He didn't ask me anything technical. He asked me for dinner on Liberty.
Oh my God.
And I had the very great feeling as I was eating dinner that he was just watching to find out whether I could use a knife and fork properly. The
Yeah.
officer class.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But of course, war breaks out in
Well,
1914.
this is the interesting thing about this, isn't it? Is that just before we move on, and Courtney sailed the Liberty through the ribbon to open the Alexandra dock in Newport,
Well, to
which
open, yeah.
which at one point was the largest sea opening lock in the world. It was only pipped like a month after it opened by Panama Canal.
True.
So he sails it through, and then literally within a month of that, we're at war. That's it.
Yeah. But
That's
Courtney doesn't rest on his laurels.
No.
He wants to set an example to the rest of the Royal Yacht Squadron. And requisitions suggest they've grabbed your vessel. Courtney offered it. He was the first to offer it.
Yeah.
To set an example to the others. Not only that, Liberty was converted into a hospital ship, but all the conversion was paid for by Courtney himself.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a lot of money. By the way, Liberty as a pleasure craft, according to one newspaper, take it with a pinch of salt, suggested that it cost £1,000 a week to run then. So this is how he's spending that Tredegar fortune.
Yeah.
But he hands it over. It's all down to him. And initially, at the start of the Great War, Courtney commands Liberty himself in the North Sea.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Doing valiant work.
Hospital ship. Yeah, that's the Red Cross on the side.
Hospital ship.
Yeah.
Oh. And here we are. And here's Courtney in the middle. The crew of Liberty was 60. It shows you how large the yacht actually was. It had a crew of 60. As we used to say on tours, his Uncle Godfrey had 22 indoor servants to run Tredegar House. Courtney needed 60 to run his yacht.
Yeah.
I did great work. I mean, after the initial sort of early bit of the war, Courtney passed over command of Liberty to someone else, and Liberty did great work at Gallipoli. Because Courtney had a new job, which we'll go on to in a minute, and actually probably more valuable than his work on Liberty. But first of all, Liberty became quite a famous yacht. In fact, it became a stamp in the 1980s.
Oh, gosh, never.
Isn't that wonderful?
Hey, I never knew that. Oh, cool.
Liberty's a wonderful vessel. In fact, ultimately, he sold it in 1920. He didn't have it long.
No, I always thought he had it longer than that.
No, he sold it to Lady Houston, who would fly insulting messages about the Prime Minister from it. Lady Houston, though, did a lot of work for funding for Spitfires. I mean, so we'll forgive her for that. For poking Ramsay MacDonald. But when it was broken up in 1938, so it left this area, and it left 1938, it was broken up, coincidentally, at Cashmore's in Newport.
Yes, shipbreakers.
So it came back to Newport to die. The bell is still in a local church near Ebbo Bridge. And apparently, although I've never seen a picture of it, I don't know if you have, Goff, part of Liberty's hull was once in Bellevue Park. Apparently.
Part of Liberty's hull?
Part of it, yeah.
No, don't remember that at all.
No, I've never either. If anyone knows about that or has a photograph of any bit of Liberty that is still floating around out there, do let us know.
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm interested now. There we are.
Now, Courtney and Katherine had 2 children. Gwyneth, who became a wren in the Great War. Lady Katherine did her bit as well. She gave up her London home in Bryanston Square to become a hospital for the Royal Flying Corps.
Oh, right.
So well done, Lady Katherine.
Yeah.
Courtney offered up the riding school at Tredegar House to be a temporary hospital.
Yeah.
Wasn't taken up on that. And then he opened the Brecon Mansion House to become a hospital as well.
Oh.
So whatever you say about Courtney, he certainly did his bit in the Great War. And his greatest work is still to come. He had slight problems, though, with his son. The Honourable Evan Morgan.
Yeah.
Poet, musician, artist. And according to Augustus John, the Welsh guards are busy pulling and pushing him in various directions, trying to fit him into a uniform. He got into it just.
Yeah.
He enlisted for the Welsh guards, but his health was so poor. I mean, Courtney's son Evan was rather delicate health-wise and was tubercular. His lungs were in a shocking state his whole life. So whereas Courtney went off to war, and his daughter Gwyneth did a bit, and his wife Katherine did a bit, Evan essentially, not his fault, but he got a cushy desk job where he seemed to spend most of his time at parties.
Oh, yeah.
Which was not great for Courtney. It also didn't help the marriage that Courtney thought that his son needed to do his duty, but apparently Evan's mother, Lady Catherine, was pulling strings to try to get him out of being sent to France.
Yeah.
Which Courtney was not amused at, as you can imagine.
No. It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? I mean, he did actually want to do his duty as well, though.
Yes, he did. He wrote dreadful poetry about it.
But yeah, I mean, to give him his due. So, I mean, he was trying to get in there. His mother's trying to, pull his strings. So eventually he ends up working in, Ministry of Works, isn't he?
Yeah, he was the Ministry of Labour, as it was
Ministry
then.
of
He
Labour,
was a secretary to W.C. Bridgman. This is Courtney, and and he's in front of the side hall at Tredegar House there. You might recognise the door.
Yeah.
In a different uniform. Now, as a younger man, he had actually been more Army than Navy. He'd served in the Boer War.
Yeah.
And his son Evan's first memory was his father going off to war to the sounds of the Soldiers of the Queen being played by the band.
Yeah, standing there with Godfrey's Uncle Godfrey.
Yeah, exactly. And Courtney did that, and he was in charge of remounts, which is apparently fresh. I mean, it's fresh horses. And logistically, it was a big job. He was responsible for 1,000 horses being transferred to the Transvaal, and he was on General French's staff. So Courtney actually, although ill health, enteric, and dysentery brought him home from the Boer War. In World War I, after he'd set up the Liberty, he was actually the chief recruiting officer for Wales and for the Welsh Naval Brigade, which was attached to the RNVR. So soldiers attached to the Navy, essentially.
Oh, right.
There'd never been a Welsh Naval Brigade before in history.
Yeah, gosh.
Courtney was influential in setting it up.
Yeah.
He was based at the Crystal Palace. He had a recruitment office in High Street Newport and High Street Cardiff. And he did sterling work.
Yeah.
Recruiting this brand new regiment. So, I mean, Courtney, somebody actually said they were relieved because, quote, it would be an odd war without a Tredegar in it. End quote.
Interesting.
So Courtney definitely did his duty, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah.
His son, you can imagine the friction.
Yeah.
By the way, his son was always going to be slightly different. This is a wonderful picture of Evan, his son.
Yeah.
The young man being...
gosh.
This is when the Prince of Wales, the future King George V, was at the university in Cardiff. Now, even his great-uncle Godfrey knew Evan was going to be slightly different. One day at Tredegar House, young Evan Morgan had vanished. They didn't know where he'd gone, and the servants were searching for him. And they found him. He'd sneaked out of the house to unset his great-uncle Godfrey's animal traps so the animals wouldn't get hurt.
Yeah.
So from the very beginning, Evan Morgan was not going to be, as you said, the hunting, shooting, fishing Lord Tredegar. He was going to be the poet.
Yeah.
And the artist and the musician. But unfortunately also the party, the great partier, and also rather notorious. I mean, he's here painted by Ambrose McAvoy, who always fell in love with his subjects, apparently. He looks like a poet here, doesn't he? Now, Goff, you were the Bard of Betis. You were the first and only town poet in the history of Newport. What is your opinion on Evan Morgan's poetry?
Pants.
Oh. A little bit more nuanced, but fine.
I have been told by people who know better than me, one of our friends who's a Doctor of Literature, that it sits within a certain school of poetry at the time that was in thing. I can't remember the exact type of it at the time. It is not very good. The simple fact of the matter is, it is very, very conscious of its own attempts at poetry. It's trying to be poetry.
Yeah.
The best poem he ever wrote, though, was a sonnet he wrote on the death of a friend during the First World War, and that is exceptionally good piece of work. because it has a real emotional base. Evan's poetry does not have much of an emotional base to it. It's very charitably, it's very affected. It's attempting to be poetry, and he's someone who basically wants to be a poet, not necessarily wanting to write good poetry. So yeah, it's not good stuff.
I think that's fair. And I think running into this, he used to go to a place in World War One called Garsington Manor near Oxfordshire, and that was a place where you'd find what became the Bloomsbury group would go.
Yeah.
And if any of you have seen the movie Carrington with Emma Thompson, it's based Lytton Strachey, all of that set. And Evan went there and he was spotted by Virginia Woolf, who wrote in a diary rather poisonously when this car full of unprepossessing young men rattled towards her. And Virginia Woolf said the most obvious was Evan Morgan, a little red absurdity, with a beak of a nose, no chin, and with a general likeness to a callow but student bantam cock that has run to legs and neck. But he was most obviously and carefully prepared to be both a poet and an eccentricity. This was clear from his conversation, which aimed at irresponsible brilliance, and also by his clothes, which must have been copied from the usual Shelley picture.
Yeah.
Katherine Mansfield records he turned up in the middle of the Great War at Garsington Manor wearing a ruff around his neck and a velvet cape. And used to beat up people not in mufti. So
yeah.
He's a rebel, isn't he? He's a rebel at this point.
He is. He is someone living the lifestyle, living the dream. That's what it is. But that's all it really is, I'm afraid.
Meanwhile, his father, who just cannot understand this son at all, I think it's safe to say. His father, Courtney, is slipping into becoming the archetypal Lord Tredegar. In fact, in later years, he became aide-de-camp to the king for the RNVR.
Oh, right.
That's why in 1926, he is awarded a viscountcy. And what that means is they've recreated the old viscountcy of his uncle Godfrey. Not a baron anymore. He's the new first Viscount Tredegar. And that's why he was made a Viscount. He got promotion for and he's given the CBE and all these things. And I think by the standards of the day, Courtney certainly deserved them. You see the star of St. John's, St. John there on his chest as well. So as you said earlier, Goff, he is very extravagant with his yachts.
Yeah.
But he's trying to do his bit as a typical Lord Tredegar, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He wants to follow that model of aristocracy, which is sort of on its way out.
Definitely.
And which the First World War sees the death of. So this, as the years go on, Courtney still clings to this, doesn't he? And he becomes an anachronism.
Yes, and the incarnation of him as a landed peer, isn't it odd? Because there's a duality here. Because on the one side, he is this Edward. I think you described him once as the last of the Edwardians. You know, the +4s, shooting parties, that sort of thing.
Gone over the arm.
Yeah,
broken over the arm, out and there, and your +4s.
But on the other, and he was a crack shot. He could have sort of 4 birds dead in the air at the same time, which isn't great since his wife adored birds and his son Evan loved birds, was a St. Francis with them, and even looked a bit like a bird. You can imagine the arguments. As he blasted them out of the sky at Rupera Castle shoots each weekend. But on the other hand, he was the first to install electricity at Rupera Castle. He urged his uncle Godfrey to install electricity. He's involved in Pengham Moors and the aeroplane.
Yeah.
He's great with anything technical. So there is that duality, isn't there?
Yeah.
He's modern in some ways. He's desperately old-fashioned in others.
Yeah.
And he certainly can't understand his son. But then who could?
Evan was his mother's son, really. I mean, Katherine was much more of a similar artistic bent to him, so to be set up to him. So and eccentric in her own right. So I think, there was that separation. I think between husband and wife, and the children seemed to be much more in common with the mother. And again, it was Courtney just was desperate to be respectable as well, and the rest of his family weren't. They didn't give a damn about respectability.
They didn't. Well, Courtney played the game. What that was Courtney was not particularly respectable in the fact that Katherine had tea with someone who wrote this down, and Katherine said, "Oh well, of course I'm desperately lonely. and my husband has set up his mistress with a suite in the Ritz. But the
Oh,
game is, if you're discreet
yeah,
with those connections, you're fine. If you're
yeah,
indiscreet, you
yeah,
are caught in scandal. And his
yeah.
only son, Evan, was incredibly indiscreet, wasn't
Oh,
he?
yeah. Yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, he just didn't have any notion of scandalous behavior. He felt that the rules didn't apply to him, basically.
Aldous
The rules didn't
Huxley
apply
said,
to Evan. They really didn't.
Aldous Huxley, who was a close friend of Evan, especially from the Garsington years, said that for Evan Morgan, who was the fairy prince of modern life,
Hmm.
according to Huxley, his wealth was a wishing cap, which basically meant Evan could do whatever he
Oh,
wanted.
yeah, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. There were very little ramifications for Evan's behavior. There was always an opt-out because of that position of deference and privilege, which was extended to the aristocracy at that period. So Evan had a charmed life in many
Very
respects.
much so.
He didn't have to. He had no idea of wanting to follow the rules and the perceived rules because he didn't think they applied to him
No,
at all
well, why?
sorts of levels.
Why would you think? Well, there's a good example of this. I mean, Evan was gay at a time when it was extremely dangerous to be indiscreetly gay.
Yeah.
Whereas Evan would just waltz from one chaotic romantic affair to the rest. The people he left behind often had to face the music.
Oh, yeah.
Very selfish, but Evan never did.
Oh, no,
There's a,
no, they were his lovers would be arrested, charged, fined, sent home in disgrace. Evan would just be asked to go home and behave slightly more discreetly.
yeah, there's a great story of when. Do you know Gladys Cooper, the actress? Gladys Cooper was up for 3 Academy Awards, nominated 3 times. I tell you who she played. She played Rex Harrison's mum in My Fair Lady.
Oh, yes, yeah, no,
Yeah.
no.
And Gladys Cooper was a close friend of Evan. And Evan and Gladys Cooper went to a gay club or a gay bar in Paris in the 1920s, which was raided by the police.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the scene, everyone's panicking, trying to get away, knocking
Yeah.
tables over. Evan just sat there, smoking a cigarette. He lifted up one arm. Between his fingers was full of notes, full of money. And it said the French police were overwhelmed. And Evan merely brushed himself off and walked out of the club, and nothing was done.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary, really.
Oh, yeah, he was. It's a difficult thing to know how you pitch him at this. Was he a brave individual?
He wore a lot of armor. People wear armor.
Are you brave when you are that protected? You are not going to face the consequences of your actions. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think Evan it is necessarily a hero.
No.
Of gay life at this point, really. There were other people who lived more defiantly and more openly and with less protection than Evan.
Certainly with less protection.
Yeah.
I mean, Evan would turn up at, not necessarily gay, but Evan would always go. I mean, he liked dressing up as Queen Mary and appearing at places. But his favorite was at the Randolph in Oxford, where he'd turn up always dressed as the explorer Rosita Forbes.
Yeah.
Who became a friend of his, of course, over the years. There's a great quote about Evan because he was so scandal-ridden, and you literally never knew what this man was going to do next. He hated boredom.
Yeah.
It's a great one. It's like when he walked into a room, all eyes would turn to him because you were on edge. You were never sure what he was going to do next. And someone put it brilliantly. It was like a wild animal suddenly appearing amongst you, caged perhaps, but never really tamed. Perfectly true. And the birds thing, I mean, he took from his mother. I mean, he really was a St. Francis with birds. And he feared neither man nor beast, which again is dangerous when you're eccentric because you don't care.
No.
You'll do what you want. You know, social mores are not for you. And one journalist described Evan with the whole bird thing. He'd travel in with birds and exotic birds in cages, birds were everywhere. Could do anything with them.
Yeah.
But one journalist said that he was at dinner with Evan at his Queen Anne's Gate flat. And a bird, a raven, he said, I don't know if it was a raven, dropped on the table and started pecking at the food of all the guests. And Evan let that happen until a man swore or a lady screamed. And then Evan would simply say, Peter. And the bird would look at him. And beak would meet beak. And he would say, go back to your cage. And Peter would obediently fly to the top of his cage.
Gosh, yeah, interesting.
Of course, the most famous, I have to put this in, it's an eyewitness account by a journalist called Charles Graves, who's the brother of Robert Graves of I Claudius
Oh,
fame,
yeah.
you know? And Charles Graves said that he well remembered in these Oxford days when Evan would haunt the university, even though he, didn't take a degree in the end. It was just a social centre. Said, I well remember Evan picking up a apparently witless Australian parakeet from a stall at Tame Market. Very little parrot, Australian parakeet.
Yeah.
And training it to crawl up the inside of his trouser leg and to poke its head out through his fly buttons at parties. That shows his bravery and his daring, I think. And he loved shocking, didn't he? He loved shocking people.
Yeah, but there is, I mean, again, that shows that there was this wicked humor to him as well. I mean, he wasn't a totally nut job racing around and everything. There was a certain element of wit to what he was up to as well. So you could
Some of
never
it was
quite
calculated,
tell.
I think.
Oh yeah, you could never quite tell how much Evan loved to tease and play people. He'd set up all sorts of absurd scenarios between people. He'd let animals loose in the house and all sorts of things like that. So there's a mischief element with Evan and a wickedness of humor about him as well.
And it wasn't a dark, doomed wildness that inflicted his sister.
Yes, poor old
The
Gwyneth.
land of the Leek, the great niece of a hero of
Yeah.
Balaclava, and is, of course, great uncle Godfrey, Viscount Tredegar. We have Gwyneth Morgan. And Gwyneth Morgan, who, and we'll come on to this later, was apparently involved as a young girl with some of Evan's sort of occult dabblings at the young age. But Gwyneth had a rather sad time, didn't she, really, Goff? She was, well, she should have been the perfect society girl, but it didn't quite work out that way, did it?
No, she got involved in the drug trade and the drug traffic at the time. You got to remember that right up until the middle of the 20th century, there was no legal prescription on drug use. But I don't think people fully understand the ramifications of it. And as the ramifications of addiction became more clear, then eventually, of course, they started to prescribe various drugs, things that you couldn't take. And of course, Thomas, again, it for one of the things that's been talked about, even we talk about with drug use today, is that the legal prescription of it forced it underground and forced it into more dangerous people. So Evan, she did develop a drug problem. She was a wild child of the time. She would, a lot, with the party girl and the drug scene and so and so. But she did become addicted. So in order to fuel that addiction, she had to get involved with some very dangerous people. But the brilliant Billy Chan. There he is, brilliant Billy Chan.
Who has appeared, apparently, I'm told, in Peaky Blinders.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's become a... Now, I've got a few things to say about Brilliant Chang. It's hard to find the real Brilliant Chang, to be perfectly honest. And the reason with this is the newspapers are not reliable at this time. They're very sensationalist. They take the Fu Manchu idea. The Chinese population of Limehouse are terribly demeaned by the press of the day.
Interesting. Oh, that's interesting.
In my opinion, so a very great book called, I think it's Dope Girls by a really good author called Marek Cohn. And he writes about this, how they sensationalize everything. So it's really, really tricky to get to the truth. I don't think, I mean, this is Brilliant Chang or Chang Nan, as his name was. He was known as Billy Chang or Brilliant Chang. And he he was a predator is what he is. Whether he was quite the dope king of London or the dope king of Europe that the papers presented him as, this Fu Manchu character, he was a predator, make no mistake. And he used the drugs to do that. He had a restaurant, which was the front. But what he would do was he would prey on young women.
Oh, right.
And if they're aristocratic young women, say, such as Courtney Tredegar's daughter, the Honourable Gwyneth Morgan, all the better. Because what he'd do is, he had these pro forma letters which were found by the police. He had loads of these letters, which he basically gives to a young lady saying, "Oh, I've spotted you, and you're very special. I'd like to meet with you." And once you met,
let's read this out because it's a fascinating letter. It says, "Dear unknown, Please do not regard this as a liberty that I write to you, as I'm really unable to resist the temptation of having seen you so many times. I should extremely like to know you better, and should be glad if you would do me the honour of meeting me one evening where we could have a little dinner and a quiet chat together. I do hope you will consent to this, as it will give me great pleasure, and in any case do not be cross with me for having written to you. Yours hopefully,
Chang.
Chang. P.S. If you reply, please address it to me, to the Shanghai restaurant, Limehouse Causeway, East 40. You know that it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's charming, isn't it?
He was charming.
And also, for the ladies of the time as well, he is an exotic figure.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he's handsome. He's not the normal mode. When they dress him up smartly, I've seen him in tuxedos and winged collars and all things. He looks, frankly, gorgeous. So, you know, you've got this wonderful, this handsome, exotic, incredibly, you know, polite, well, the gentleman, but the hooks are something else, aren't they?
Oh, the hooks are drugs.
The hooks. These are what you're fishing with. And it's,
when he got you in his clutches, you
Yeah.
were in trouble. And that's taken away from the, you know, the caricature, the
Yeah.
just boiling it down to this.
Yeah.
Because he had loads of these letters. This is a pro forma letter that the police actually found.
Pro forma.
He is not the dope king of Europe.
No.
But if you're a woman, and he spotted you, you're going to get one of these letters.
Yeah.
And he will hook you because he is very charming. In fact, he had one court case where he actually was found innocent. And there were loads of young ladies, like a fan club.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, the serial killers get this, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm not comparing Chang
No.
Say a Ted Bundy, but you do get that.
Oh, yeah.
A fan club. And they were running fingers through Chang's hair and also, so you're quite right. He was extremely charming, but extremely dangerous. And it seems at some point that Gwyneth may well have got enmeshed with brilliant Chang. We know she became addicted to drugs.
Yeah.
And from that, you know, that Wren, that glamorous Wren, she did alter.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it got very dark indeed. I should point out, by the way, Gwyneth disappears in December 1924. Her father, Courtney, has put her with essentially a nurse, a carer at the Niche in Wimbledon. I like to think he tried to find the most dull part of London he could possibly find for Gwyneth. He chose Wimbledon.
Yeah.
In the 1920s.
Yeah.
But Gwyneth slips out into the fog and is not heard from for months, is she?
No, she goes. She disappears for 6 months. There are all these reports of sightings that she's seen at all the various fashionable watering holes across Europe. People report seeing her there. The papers are sort of up in arms about the American papers, particularly, are all over it like a rash. I think Courtney managed to keep a lot of it out of the British press. Oh, yeah, Pittsburgh press, there we are. But the American press are all over. This is the beautiful Miss Gwyneth, his lordship's only daughter. And it's a scandal story, isn't it? I mean, look at the headlines there.
Oh, yeah.
Chinatown's slums, months of unspeakable dens, and the Waterhouse Lime down. I mean,
it makes the Washington Post. This is big international news. The disappearance of Gwyneth Morgan.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. But then, sadly, when Sergeant Mathers of the Thames Police, in May of 1925, so what's that, 5 months, almost 6 months that she's vanished, and Courtney has hired private detectives. It's a bit cruel because psychics appear and say, check under the stairs and all of this nonsense.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And unfortunately, a body does float to the surface sort of 5-6 months after it was put there near Pocock's Wharf, near Rotherhithe.
Yeah.
And around the neck of the body is a shattered turquoise shaped like a bird, which Evan had given Gwyneth to ward off evil spirits. And she couldn't bear to be without it, so even when it broke, she mended it herself with the ginger beer bottle wire. And the tab on the clothing says GEM, Gwyneth Erica Morgan. It appears that they have found Lord Tredegar's missing daughter. And then, of course, the question is, what on earth happened to her? Well, the American press jump on it again. Death of Lord Morgan's. Sick.
Oh, murder mystery.
London police theory is that woman may have been killed in Limehouse Den and body thrown into river. So this is, this is huge headlines.
Yeah.
Well, what we do know...
Interesting. I've never seen this before, this article. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, there's lots just like it. This is just an example.
Wow.
What we do know is an absolute fact, and you have to go with the facts on this because we don't know what happened.
Hmm.
We know she was alive when she entered the River Thames.
Yes.
So she was not killed in a limehouse den and body thrown into the river. She was alive when she entered the river, but we don't know
Yeah.
what state she was in when she entered the
No.
river. So
No.
I mean, it's a horrible thing, isn't it?
It is. It is so. It is. It's one of the It is genuinely unexplained because even when you
Yeah.
get, beg your pardon, stand up, my knees hurting. It genuinely unexplained because even when you get to the coroner's inquiry, they have an open verdict. They can't even bring a narrative verdict. They have to say,
Can't, no.
basically, we do not really know what has gone on here, what has actually happened here. Courtney, I think, thought it was suicide
Yeah,
because
because
she
she
thought that
tried it
Evan was
before. Yeah.
unstable, and she had tried it before, and she had tried to commit suicide by drowning before.
Yeah.
So Courtney thought of that, but Evan, however, is of the obviously the American press. Evan thought that she had been killed, that it was a murder.
Rather, yeah.
And it's possible. I mean, we've talked about the Theas and the way the body was found lying, and various situations that she may have gone to one of the dens, and it's possible that she'd overdosed and they got rid of the body before it could be, cause a problem for them on whatever premises she was at, and flipped her into the water. She was still breathing at the time when she went in. But she was dying of an overdose, possibly. So I mean, it is just speculation. You cannot. We will never get really to the root
No,
of
we
what
won't.
happened to poor old Gwyneth.
I can tell you a fact who did not do it directly, and
Yeah.
that was Brilliant Chang.
Yeah.
Because Brilliant Chang had been arrested earlier in 1924.
Yeah.
Chang gets arrested, he then gets deported, and we don't actually know what happens to Chang. We
Oh,
don't know when he
interesting.
dies. We don't know what happens to him when he gets deported from Britain. So it's it's an extremely sad story. I mean, as we know, Goff, Courtney had her buried at Putney Vale Cemetery, Wimbledon, and for years I used to say this was purely to get the scandal away from Tredegar House. And I'm starting to think Courtney genuinely believed his daughter had committed suicide. And there were only certain places you could bury a suicide at that time. So I think, yes, there was an element of keeping the scandal away from the Tredegar estate. But if Courtney is firm in his belief and his faith, then he could not have buried Gwyneth at St. Basil's Church, Basleg, with the rest of the Morgans if he genuinely believed she was a suicide.
Oh,
So
that's
I think I've been
interesting.
a bit harsh on Courtney.
Well, a lot of people thought with what the thinking is, but then again, if you look at that, yeah, so she could be buried on consecrated ground as a suicide. So that's why but why Pulteney Vale is pretty far away. Why did he
No,
choose?
no, no. Oh, well, Putney Vale is the closest to her home at the time.
Oh, I see. So, right. So it's
It's
sort of a
Wimbledon.
local municipal cemetery then.
I'm not saying he was right. I'm just saying I can sort of understand the thinking of a grieved,
Yeah,
bereaved father. However, who didn't agree with him was his son Evan,
yeah,
who was furious, and he vowed that when he became Lord Tredegar, he would bring Gwyneth home,
yeah,
which is indeed what he did in November of 1934, when Gwyneth was interred at St. Basil's Church, Basleg, and rather wonderfully was buried next to her father.
So how interesting. So yeah, so evidently the church accepted that it wasn't suicide then.
Well, eventually, yeah. I mean, but
So
remember
basically, so Courtney must have believed it was suicide,
how he did.
and that's why he didn't have her buried on religious ground.
He
How,
wasn't the only one to think it was
how
suicide.
well, how interesting.
But I think for
Oh yeah, yeah,
years I've been wrong. I think for years I've been having a pop at Courtney about this, and maybe he was wrong, but you can sort of see the reasons.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? A really difficult one. You're not in their shoes in this case.
No.
Not in the shoes. You can't really judge.
Lady Catherine was not at the funeral of Gwyneth
Oh,
or the reburial, 1934, of Gwyneth. And this is because she really did ultimately plunge into what could be called a serious mental health crisis. Her doctor was quoted in 1943 using the terminology of the time that Catherine was actually of a schizoid temperament
yeah.
because she became very badly mentally ill.
Mm.
And I guess the good thing about this is that she sort of slipped into her own world, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
What we do know about Katherine is she did have this obsession with birds. The author, the journalist Cecil Roberts, describes meeting Katherine, and she was charming about the modern art movement and fashion, and she was very good about this. And then after dinner, the footman arrived with twigs, grass, moss, bits of string, and with great dexterity, Katherine would create a miniature bird's nest, which she would go fishing, she called it, for bird tenants. A footman would then put this nest in a tree or a bush and hope that the feathered friends would find it useful.
Yeah.
Sadly, as the years went on, it seems she disappeared into this her own sort of world. I mean, she did become very seriously ill. So an absent parent, but an understandably absent parent, I think it's safe to say.
Yes. Yeah. And
She
again,
hated noise.
you see one of the difficulties with Katherine as well is that there are, to the extent of her mental health, is quite difficult to judge because there are a lot of unkind rumours circulated at the time.
Oh, lots.
Which, sadly, I think in earlier days, about 30 odd years ago, we were just as worse in spreading as well because we didn't have the sensitivity about mental health problems, I think, at the time. So a lot of people, a lot of extraordinary stories were spread about Katherine. Those stories are historical fact. The fact that the stories existed are historical fact. The truth of them is entirely questionable. But who was that? There was one chap who used to very cruelly push twigs through a letterbox.
Oh, Brian Howard.
Brian Howard
Used to push twigs through a letterbox in Grosvenor Square.
Grosvenor Square.
Oh, the whole nest thing was well known in society.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So it's a very difficult issue. I think Katherine needs to be looked at. More
this is painted
and more difficult.
This is painted by Augustus John. I mean, she also, of course, therefore didn't attend the extraordinary wedding of her only son, Evan.
Yeah.
Because Evan had reached the stage where Courtney had had enough, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Evan had had affair after affair, which could have ruined him because he wasn't discreet. He had a bit with Ronald Furbank, which was perhaps Furbank liked Evan, but Evan didn't return it. Furbank's, if you just watch our St. Julian's House podcast where Furbank appears. But Evan did have an affair with a man who was one of the many models, I think, for Evelyn Moore's Sebastian of Brideshead Revisited, called Aleister Graham. And they were at the Cavendish Hotel in Jermyn Street, run by Rosa Lewis, later immortalised in the 1970s by the BBC as the Duchess of Duke Street.
Oh.
Duke Street being around the corner from Jermyn Street. And there is actually a line in that where one flapper says to the other, "Oh, I've been on safari with Evan Morgan. Did he bite you?" "No, but his parrot did."
Oh, gosh.
But evidently, whether it was a setup or not, Evan and Aleister Graham were found in one of the rooms. And it became a scandal that his father, Lord Tredegar, had to stomp out. And Lord Tredegar decided, you've got to get married. You've got to get married now. Which in 1928 he did to a friend of his, friend of the family, former neighbour, actually, in Portman Square, Lois Sturt. Lois Sturt, the Honourable Lois Sturt, the daughter of Lord Allington of Critchell, near Wimborne in Dorset, was a force of nature every bit Evan's equal. She opened a studio in Chelsea when it wasn't fashionable. She made it fashionable. She was an artist. She could fly an aeroplane. She had a license for that. She was one of the few female racehorse owners, and she played Nell Gwyn in the first British colour film, The Glorious Adventure of 1922. And it's basically two friends have to get married to try to rescue their name in society. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's forget, we need to mention that Lois was equally scandalous.
Oh, Lois was damaged goods.
Oh, yeah.
Lois was known as Fast for a long-term affair with the very married, Reginald Earl of Pembroke.
Yeah.
From Wilton House, who, when they met, she was 19, he was 44.
Oh,
nevertheless,
difference, good lord.
The Countess of Pembroke might not necessarily give Lois any leeway over that.
Yeah.
When I was an innocent sort of 19-year-old, not the sophisticated man about town that I now am, you understand, I wrote to Wilton House because Lois at the National Library of Wales at Aberystwyth, she kept every single love letter sent to her by Reggie Pembroke. Brilliant condition, wonderful. I thought, has any survived? So I contacted the current Earl of Pembroke, thinking enough time had passed.
Yeah.
And I had this rather snooty reply.
Oh,
Any correspondence with that woman, can't put my back up,
yeah.
with that woman would have been judiciously destroyed many years ago. That was
Oh,
it.
gosh,
I
interesting.
thought, fair enough, but I thought enough time had passed that it became history, but clearly
No,
still
still a sore
sensitive,
point. Still a sore point.
still a sore point.
Oh yeah,
What
so I
we,
mean, we don't leave the impression that Evan marries, a nice, respectable young lady
oh gosh, no. A
who
bright
knows
young
no,
thing,
who knows
fast.
naught of his scandalous behaviour. No, she perfectly knew. She's part of the game. See, they both married each other to give each other an air of respectability because
Oh,
they
yeah.
needed it, and well, all it was a show, wasn't it, Paul?
Yeah, she became a Catholic for the occasion. Because Evan had actually, we
Yeah.
haven't mentioned this yet, Evan, much to the horror of his father and much of his family, converted to Roman Catholicism in 1919. And at one point,
Mm.
Evan actually trained for the priesthood at the
Oh
Pontifical
yes,
Beda College in Rome.
yeah.
It was actually said that he spent most of his time sending his chauffeur or valet to the lectures dressed in a
Yeah.
cowl rather than him. While he was at the parties at the Hotel Bernini round the corner, arm in arm with the Siamese ape. So he didn't have the vocation for the priesthood, but he was a very big Roman Catholic, which we'll talk
Yeah.
about a little bit later. So Lois had to become a Catholic, and Lois, wide-eyed,
Yeah.
when she converted, actually said, I think it was Father Martindale at Farm Street, the big Catholic church in that area, Mayfair area. She actually said, I'm bound to be a bad Catholic because everything I've done in my life has been bad.
Oh God.
Well, actually, as a girl, she was. If you were a girl, you wouldn't want to be near Lois because she did everything well. She was an acrobat. She could paint. She could, she was very talented.
Yeah.
But she had this reputation as. It was said that Prince George, Duke of Kent, wanted to marry Lois Sturt. She
Oh
could have
right.
been the Duchess of Kent, for goodness'
Yeah.
sake, before George V put the royal veto on that.
Yeah.
Lois was known as fast,
Hmm.
and then some.
Yeah.
Barbara Cartland was a friend of hers, as was Diana Mosley. And Barbara Cartland said she was fiery, impetuous, and had dark, flashing eyes, quick to temper were her
Oh.
main feature. She had a cage of live monkeys on the stairs. Right,
Oh God.
right, Barbara Cartland.
Yeah.
Okay.
Didn't she also, if I'm led to believe this, have sorry, say a pornographic bathroom ceiling?
Oh, actually, do you know what? That was Evan's fault. That was in Evan's Queen
Oh.
Anne's Gate flat.
Oh right.
And Evan, again, Evan was a fantasist.
Yeah.
So some of the things he told you, the dull things often were lies, and the most extraordinary things turned out to be true. But you were
Yeah.
never supposed to take Evan literally. But Evan
Yeah.
did say at Queen Anne's Gate he did have a pornographic ceiling,
Oh,
and when he sold the flat, he forgot about it, and according to I believe that bit. But then Evan says he had to break in and destroy the mechanism.
oh yeah, because it was concealed. You pulled a little switch and the ceiling opened, and then
The ceiling open.
and you
I
got a great
wouldn't
deal
put
of
that past
surprise. Yeah.
Lois. No, I wouldn't put that past Lois. By the way, down here is one of our favourites, Golf. This is Naps.
Oh, her brother.
Naps, Golf.
Naps Allington. Good old Naps Allington. Love his
Naps
tiny.
Allington. Tallulah Bankhead went crazy over Napier Allington.
Yeah.
Napier, the bisexual Lord Allington of Critchell, died in his 40s during World War II. He's a great character as well. He once gilded the driveway at Critchell for a guest.
Gilded.
Gold leaf on the driveway up to his home. He once said he'd pay the fare of a taxi and got in a taxi and, and basically said, I want to go to Paris. He's nowhere near France at the time.
No.
He had a white farm at Critchell where every animal was white. The Sturts were interesting.
Yes, quite. Yeah. Yeah. You can tell how they lived comfortably next door to the Tredegar's there, can't you? Yeah.
Oh, they were, I hesitate to use this term, but birds of a feather, right?
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
And here's Lois. She played Nell Gwyn. I wouldn't mess with her, I tell you.
Yeah,
I mean, the fire of with the Lady Diana Manners, who became the great society beauty Lady Diana Cooper. So Lois was in all the film magazines in the early 20s, but she was fiery. And when they married at the Brompton Oratory on Cup Final Day 1928, it was a grand scene, you can imagine. G.K. Chesterton was up against a pillar.
Yeah.
He always turned up late, G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah.
And G.K. Chesterton was, do you agree, Goff, of the large variety?
Oh yes, he was ample. He was
ample.
He liked the pleasures of wine and the table. and spoke a lot of it at time. Yes, he was a great big,
Father
large,
Brown.
avuncular gentleman. Who enjoyed the good life. There's a wonderful story of him dining with Bernard Shaw, who was a very austere eater. And Chesterton said to him, "So, Mr. Shaw, the way you eat, one may consider that there's still a famine in Ireland." And Shaw said, "It's the way you eat, Mr. Chesterton. You would think that you caused it."
Great. There's a great line with J.K. Chesterton, a great Catholic writer, of course, Father Brown, for those who don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of you have been watching Father Brown, the recent adaptation with Mark Williams. But he was large, and he said there are some compensations being this size. Only the other evening on the Underground, I had the great honor of offering my seat up to 3 ladies.
Yeah, I'm not surprised he turned up late, because Chesterton was incredibly vague.
Yeah.
And how he ever got anywhere on time for anything, it's a miracle. There's a wonderful occasion where he sent a telegram back to his wife in London saying, "I have arrived at Crewe. Where do I go now?"
Where should I be? Yeah.
Where should I be? And she said, "You should be home, dear." Oh, so he just basically got entirely the wrong thing. Oh.
My favourite,
he was always away with the fairies.
My favourite is when G.K. Chesterton wrote a letter to his mother, apologising for not being able to visit her, forgetting he was actually in the room with his mother as he was writing the letter. But he was in the Catholic Poetry Society, which Evan had helped co-found. So you had this, and Hilaire Belloc and people like that, the whole Catholicism thing. When Evan married Lois, Chips Channon's diaries, which the unabridged version is now available, and Chips Channon does not stop on this. He does not hold back. He says, "This must be the only congregation I've ever known who have slept with both the bride and the groom."
Oh, good Lord.
They went for a honeymoon to Rome, and they had an audience with the Pope.
Oh.
By this time, Evan was a chamberlain to the Pope.
Yeah.
But Britain needs Evan, I think you'll agree.
Yeah.
And in 1929, Evan and Lois decided to stand for political office. Evan could have had a safe Conservative seat. Evan chose Limehouse. It's the landlord's son. What hope did he have?
Yeah.
But apparently he would turn up his campaigning because he got bored. At one point he turned up and a door opened and all you would see was an arm and a hand. And on the hand was a ring Evan said belonged to the Black Prince. You never know. Maybe. With a minor bird. And the minor bird was either told to say vote Morgan or vote Tory. Whichever was easier, I suppose. And then Evan would appear, this long streak in perfect, Savile Row suits, possibly with Lois as well. But Lois was also busy because she was campaigning for the LCC, the London County Council.
Yeah. Yeah, that's any letter.
You see at the back there, it says vote for Allington and Sturt.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Because Napier Allington was also with her on the same sort of ticket. She lost, but she beat Naps.
Oh, right. Gosh, interesting.
Evan lost, but understandably in Limehouse, he beat the Liberal who didn't like him, J. Addis.
Yeah.
But he lost to, future Prime Minister Clement Attlee as Evan's opponent.
Oh.
In Limehouse in 1929. Perhaps an understandable loss.
Quite. Yeah.
Well, we have Courtney. We've forgotten about Courtney at Tredegar House.
Yeah.
And Courtney had continued with his way with his staff of servants, who we see here.
Oh, I'm one of the board servants' balls in the servants.
Yep. Man at the front here is Edward Perrott, who was butler for Godfrey. He was from Lambeth. I suppose he didn't do the Lambeth War because he served the dinner, but you never know. And he's the house steward under Courtney. And he said at one point that as the politics of Europe tilted to the left, and there could very well be some kind of revolution at some point in the 1920s, Courtney, echoing something his uncle Godfrey had said earlier on, actually said at a servants' ball, "Well, this time next year, you may well call me Comrade Morgan, and I shall call you Comrade Perrott." Mr. Perrott said, "Well, that may be so, Comrade Morgan, but your dinner will be on time, as usual." The feudal spirit, I think P.G. Wodehouse would call that. The feudal spirit.
Yeah.
Courtney was an interesting master. Now, you're quite right in saying that in the early days, he would only talk to the senior servants. There was one footman, Mr. Deacon, who later became butler to Squire Williams at Lanrumney Hall, another one of our podcasts. who said that in the 4 or 5 years he was a footman, Courtney said one thing to him, and that was, "Bring Mr. Parrot to me."
Oh,
But then as he gets older, he softens, doesn't he?
yes. Well, Courtney's sight deteriorates. He'd always been he got progressively poor sight even when he came back from the Boer War. There's an interesting version about Pulitzer's ship. The Liberty was also just Pulitzer had incredibly poor sight as well. So they think the ship was designed for someone with poor sight. So it's interesting that he bought that as well. So his sight gradually deteriorates and over the years. And by the time he gets into the late 20s, 1920s, the early 30s, Courtney is practically, blind, virtually blind. And he travels around, he uses the arm of one of the footmen to get around. He goes around with one of the old shepherds who also has the dog that leads them about the estate. So he gets a more dependent relationship upon the servants and a more physical closeness to them as well. You know, if you're walking around on someone's arm, you can't keep a distance from them.
Yeah.
So as a result, that formality slips. He almost gets a bit bored with it himself as well, I think, because he'd been raised in households which had the Morgan informal tradition. And I think in later life, when he needed people more as people rather than servants, I think that's when the change. So he's a much more relaxed individual in this. There's a nice story by one of the gardeners where Courtney's wandering through the garden, slightly half cut, at the end of an evening, and he wobbles past, and he comes back, and he said, "You didn't say hello to me." And the chap said, "Well, I didn't know you wanted to, my lord." And he said, "Well, good lord, I mean, if I was in your garden and you came in, you'd expect me to say hello to you." So that almost shows the change of he gets a much more personal relationship, and the formality falls away.
Yeah, absolutely right. You're quite right about the blind shepherd near Baselig, where Courtney would go for long walks. And the shepherd, Morris, his name was, had a sheepdog called Bluebell, who would tap the leg of Morris every time a sheep went past to count it.
Oh,
it was right within 1 or 2. And
gosh.
Courtney and Morris, 2 blind men, would go for wanders. What we see here is Courtney in his later life. He was very good with Lois. I think he was relieved that anyone had taken on his son Evan.
Yeah.
And very good with Lois. And you see them here in 1932 when they went on a cruise together to Ceylon. And you also see Courtney's nephew, Avis. Morgan, or Avis Gurney, as she became. And with the doctor and the doctor's wife. And there's the great story, isn't it, about Courtney? Because Lois had a pet monkey. I've got to say this story, Garth.
Yeah.
Lois had a pet monkey, and at Tredegar House, Courtney was having a conversation with Foster Steadman of Mac and House fame, another podcast, and in the new hall, and this monkey had got into Lois's makeup and essentially eaten her lipstick, which had smeared it all over its face.
Yeah.
And it danced down the staircase covered in Lois's makeup, and it danced past Lord Tredegar and Foster Steadman, the agent. And Courtney, without missing a beat, said, "Really, Lois has let herself go dreadfully."
Yeah. Courtney leapt in my estimation just for that joke. As soon as I heard that joke, I thought, "Yep, he's all right."
Apparently, he used to be able to. Oh, by the way, there is an inventory taken in 1923 about Courtney's Tredegar House. And it tells us that there was always wine in his cellar to the value of £5,000, which is about $250,000 in today's money.
Oof, blimey.
But also some of the things he owned. He owned a gold cigarette case, a square gold cigarette case, a small gold cigarette case, a larger gold cigarette case wood with crest, gold cigarette case, cigarette box with jade and emeralds, gold matchbox in tortoise shell, gold lighter, wooden cigarette case, leather cigarette case, gold cigarette case, platinum cigarette case. He ended up smoking in later life. But earlier, you could always smell him because he loved Simmons scented cigarettes of Piccadilly. So you could smell Lord Tredegar before you saw him, quite frankly.
Oh my gosh.
But this gets quite serious. Lois, by now, had enough of Evan. They were both wildly unfaithful to each other.
Yeah.
Evan with numerous men. Lois with Timothy Freeland, and also a man which we've called Monsieur Boulanger.
Yeah.
who ran the aquarium at London Zoo, but I
Yeah.
don't think it was pronounced Boulanger, and I'm afraid I think he was English rather than French. But I like the idea of a sort of a Hercule Poirot with a twizzly moustache hiding behind the curtains in his.
How terribly disappointing.
I know, I'm
You're not
sorry.
Mr. Boulanger. Oh no.
Uh,
Oh, you're not the same as Monsieur Boulanger.
Anyway, at this point, Lois is serious, and in 1933 she files for divorce, and she does not pull her punches.
Yes, it's
She
interesting.
accuses Evan of adultery with a man or two men in a hotel in Berlin.
Yeah.
So she's accusing him of breaking the law officially, really.
Hmm.
So whether Courtney took her on this cruise, he used to call her Nutty.
Oh yeah.
That was her nickname, Nutty, Lois. But clearly the cruise didn't solve the problem because in 1933 she filed for divorce, but something solved the problem because it was dropped.
That's interesting. So we don't know why it was dropped.
We don't know why it was dropped. The papers survived, but they never did get divorced. They just separated.
Hmm.
When Courtney was blind, you weren't allowed to open doors at Tredegar House because he was adamant that he could see, he could feel, even though he couldn't see.
Yeah.
And you weren't allowed to move furniture because he knew the layout of the rooms. What he did add was this set of steps outside the gilt room because he couldn't use the railless front steps, but he knew where he was when he got into the cedar garden. So he would wander down here and head off to the gardens. Here he is in later years with the Girl Guides.
Yeah. But also one thing we haven't mentioned is how tall Courtney was.
Yeah, a big man, wasn't he?
He was
6'3", 6'4".
He was 6'3", 6'4". I mean, that is astronomical for the average height of the time.
Especially for the Morgans.
For the Morgans were notoriously on the short side.
Reginald Blewett called them a runt-like race.
Yeah, I know. They were quite. Well, I mean, that's just a little unfair. I mean, Godfrey was 5'8". I mean, and they were taller than the people around them. But yeah, there's a wonderful a clip of him on one of the BFI sites as a young man at one of the ceremonies at the Cenotaph in Newport, and he is literally head and shoulders above every other person there.
You can see that video on our Lanarth Court podcast because he opens the Cenotaph with Lord Treowen.
That's it. Court. Oh, that's right. Yeah. So, I see. So even though you see Courtney there at the front, the people behind him are probably average height about 5'8", 5'10". He is just colossally big for his height.
He's a big man. I did a tour once and someone said, well, I remember the old Lord Tredegar, meaning Courtney, because I was with a bunch of kids and we'd see him wandering around the grounds. And because he was blind, he couldn't see. So we'd open the gates for him.
Yeah.
He always did the same thing. He would say, thank you, children. How many of you are there? And if there were 3 of us, we'd say 6. Courtney would fish into his pockets and bring out 6 pennies,
Oh, God.
He could afford it.
Yeah.
He could afford it.
Yeah.
Courtney died in 1934 at the age of 67 at the Ritz Hotel in London. His mistress, Lady Rodney, was there. His son, Evan, was one of the last to hear that Courtney had died of bronchitis. He'd come back. He'd gone to Australia. He'd come back on the same liner that brought the Australian cricket team for the Ashes that year. And he died at the Ritz at the age of 67. Evan was bobbing up and down on a yacht owned by a millionaire American called Billy Leeds, just off Florida. So he was one of the last to know that he was actually the new Viscount. Yeah, Courtney, I think over the years, I've started to reevaluate Courtney, really. I think he's actually more useful than I originally pegged him as. Yeah,
he was always painted as a sort of just dilettante, hunting, shooting, fishing aristocrat, that sort. But it seems to do the damn sight more, I think, particularly as a younger man. Yeah.
It did mean that the new Lord Tredegar was this chap, his only son Evan. Every time I see him in the robes, I remember what he did one evening at Tredegar House when an American lady with a cine-cam, you know where I'm going with this, don't you? Yep. I'm going there. A cine-cam said, oh, you've just been to the coronation of George VI, which he had. According to Chips Channon, Evan led the Viscounts out with a swanky gesture. I'm not sure what that means. From the coronation. And she pestered Evan all night. Wear the robes. I want to take you in the robes. So Evan wore the robes and he said, take me as I come down the staircase. And she set up the camera and he came down the great staircase, just like Lois's monkey all those years before. Yeah. And at the right time, Evan opened his robes and revealed the robes were the only thing he was wearing. I don't think the film was actually showable in Rhode Island after Mrs. Iselin had taken that. But he looks like a normal Lord Tredegar here, less so here. This is
Yep.
Somerset the kangaroo, one of his pets.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had
The sheds still survive at Tredegar House, don't they? Where the kangaroo sheds were. The sheds are still there in the back.
they are.
His menagerie sheds are still there.
I wouldn't like to be the member of staff whose early job is to feed the kangaroo. I think you give that to the work experience person and giggle, don't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Kangaroos are dangerous.
Yeah.
Don't turn your back on Somerset the kangaroo, otherwise you'll be in serious problems. By this time, by the way, the Tredegar hunt had left Tredegar House. Courtney had given it up, saying, I'm a blind old man and can do no more. And the Tredegar hunt went to Squire Williams at Lanrumney Hall.
Yeah.
Evan, however, decided to fill up the house with his own pets and a small zoo he established, including Somerset the kangaroo. There was also the rather more sinister Bimbo the dog-faced baboon who would apparently stalk the gardeners.
Yeah.
My brother's a gardener at the moment. I think he could do with a baboon stalking him to liven him up a bit. He'll never watch this. He'll never watch this. Don't worry about it. Evan had an anteater. He had snakes in his bedroom. He had rabbits. He had all kinds of. I mean, his wife Lois, who didn't go to Tredegar House much, had a pet fox on a diamond-encrusted lead. Which isn't really the Tredegar way, having a pet fox.
No.
There were Great Danes. There were monkeys in heated cages. There were aquatic wildfowl on the lake. One of only 3 lots of hummingbirds in the country was at Tredegar Park. And the line between the menagerie run by a man called Mr. Pitt, known almost inevitably as Pitt the Younger, and the country weekend house parties, which Evan threw on a grand scale, it was a thin line. The animals would invade the weekend house parties, sometimes encouraged by Evan.
Oh, yeah. You just let them in for a laugh. Yeah. You let the bear into the house once, didn't you, for a bit of a giggle?
Wow, it was fun.
And then
got drunk, though, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, he got drunk. Yeah, he got drunk in the library and he had to hold it out. And then eventually, on a stretcher.
Oh.
And then, basically there were a drinks cabinet in every single room of the house, well-stocked drinks cabinet.
Yeah.
The menagerie would not be acceptable under today's circumstances, shall we say, the conditions. But at the time, he was a very accomplished naturalist. He wasn't. It's an interesting thing about Evan. Evan is, you can present, if you're not careful, you treat him as a joke. He was eccentric, but he wasn't a fool. You know, he didn't understand the care of animals. He was interested in the care of animals.
Yes, he was.
You know, so I mean, he was. So we have to take him for all the eccentricity of the man's behaviour. There was a serious individual who knew what was going on. You know, with what was happening there.
He was the first Morgan to produce a bill in the House of Lords that didn't directly affect him. I mean, he was the one that put in the bill to ban gin traps.
That's
terrible
right.
Traps that were. It failed, but years later, a similar bill passed, and the Daily Mirror editorial praised the late Viscount Tredegar.
Oh, yeah.
No, he was way ahead when it came to animal rights.
Well, it's interesting with the gin traps, particularly.
Way ahead.
Those were the trips he was unsetting as a child with Godfrey.
Years ago, yeah. You're quite right. You're quite right. But here we are. What we have here, by the way, is part of his aviary, which Courtney had installed to try to get the birds out of the house.
Oh, right. I see. Oh, right.
And we got to see the garden.
The orangery garden now, yeah.
The orangery garden. We got Sir Briggs's grave, Godfrey's horse, for those who saw the last episode, and the kitchen garden, which did become St. Joseph's School that I went to and is now a housing estate.
Yes, yeah.
It makes me feel very young. Not just animals, birds. Of course, it's birds. And this is the iconic, I know it's a terrible word, but I think this is iconic locally, this photo, of Blue Boy Hyacinth Macaw, who originally was bought by Evan with a mate, but the mate didn't survive the trip to Wales.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The Blue Boy was bereaved.
Yeah.
Blue Boy had the intelligence of a small child. It was often in the servants' hall. Some say it was the real Lord Tredegar.
Yeah.
And if you poked your head around the servants' hall in the evening and said, "Good night, Blue Boy," Blue Boy would say good night. If you tried it the next morning and said, "Good night, Blue Boy," Blue Boy would tell you where to go. Or ignore you completely.
Ignore you completely, yeah.
Evan was great with birds.
I love this picture because out of all the picture, the only person that knows that they're having their photograph taken is the parrot.
Oh, Blue Boy found the camera, didn't he?
Blue Boy is looking at the camera. Everybody else hasn't got a clue. It's quite strange that he's looking right at you, isn't he? That beady little eye is following you around the room.
Blue Boy loved, and this becomes more of an issue as the years go by, quite frankly. I would have thought at one point I might like Blue Boy, but Blue Boy would attack the bald heads of men and the pearl necklaces of women. So quite frankly, the older I get, the more pearl necklaces I buy off. He'd snuggle up. He'd snuggle up to you and rip your buttons off, and he would swear ferociously, and he would nip your ankles, and he terrified the guest. He was described as Evan's familiar.
Yes.
An interesting term.
It is interesting term when you know some of the other things that Evan was up to, yeah.
Let's see some of the other guests and some of the other animals. We have Alice the bear, who was lovely. Godfrey Wynne fell in love with Alice. Wrote pages in the Express about how lovely Alice was.
Oh, gosh.
Alice would gambol between your legs and run around the lawn, and she was gentle, unlike Blue Boy, the malicious macaw. Yeah. And this chap here is Thomas Beecham.
Oh, yeah.
Thomas Beecham did one of the early concerts at the Brangwyn Hall in Swansea, and there was a mural there which featured a, quote, honey bear. I know it's not the right scientific term. And he stopped and he looked at Evan in the front row and pointed to it and said, Alice.
Oh.
Because Thomas Beecham, and it could be that Evan paid for some of the murals as well, so maybe did it to put Alice immortalized. Yeah. So if any of you go to the Brangwyn Hall, is Alice still there?
Oh, blimey, interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. Somebody did say the problem with British classical music was that it had TB.
Oh,
Beecham.
Oh dear.
Harsh. Yeah, weekend party, because he threw these incredible weekend parties where the drinks bill on average was £250, which in today's close to 20 grand.
Oh yeah, it's phenomenal money at the time. It's a good annual income, a very good annual income, 250 quid.
It's Evan and Blue Boy.
Oh yeah,
in his Turkish robes. Blue Boy was terrible. Absolutely terrifying. Rollo the Great Dane, a bit more conventional. Dear me. And what I've got here is not to show H.G. Wells on this pillar.
Oh.
Evans there. It's to show this chap. This is Harry Ware.
Oh.
Evan ultimately fell out with his father's agent, Foster Stedman, hunting, shooting, fishing, and his mate, who was his secretary, Harry Ware, was given the job as agent of the Tredegar estate. And you will always see Harry Ware, won't you, Goff? Always one step away from Evan during this era.
Yeah.
He would babysit new guests, because these house parties with birds and animals and whatever, and Evan being outrageous, Harry Ware was the sensible, solid one that you could rely on to sort of walk you through it, really.
Yeah, yes.
And he'd also take the Protestant members of staff to church at St. Basil's Basilic on a Sunday.
Yeah.
Evan, of course, being Roman Catholic, would go to St. David's Church near Ebbo Bridge in Maze Glass. Now, what we've got here, and more parties, is Rollo the Great Dane. And what we have here, this is very dangerous.
I'm going to say yes. You would really not want Blue Boy in that position. He looks like he's thinking about it as well, doesn't he?
And this chap is Dudley Delavigne. Dudley Delavigne was the sister of someone you wrote a murder mystery character of, Doris Castle Ross.
Oh, right.
And Dudley Delavigne is actually the grandfather of the actress and model Cara Delevingne.
Yeah.
Now, it might not have happened.
Yeah.
Cara Delevingne's career hung in the balance right there, didn't it? Cara Delevingne's existence hung in the balance with Dudley and Blue Boy.
Yeah.
Aldous Huxley.
Oh,
Aldous Huxley turns up with Stephanie Hohenlohe, better known as Hitler's Princess.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Aldous Huxley turns up at Tredegar House twice in 1936, very old friend of Evan. And in fact, in his first novel, Chrome Yellow, Evan appears as Ivor Lombard.
Yeah.
H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
Evan H.G. Wells. Now, H.G. Wells had a nightmare at Tredegar House, didn't he, Goff?
Yes. Basically, whenever he turned up, he suffered some vast form of indignity, didn't he? So
Yeah.
falling in the lake while doing a manuscript,
Yeah.
being lashed across the face by a monkey's tail at the dining table, being too frightened to come into the house because he saw a panther go in through the front door. I mean, it's just unending, isn't it? It's something. Did a ladder fall on him at some point? Or was that a different
Well,
party?
that wasn't here, but yeah, a ladder did fall on
Fall
H.G. Wells.
everywhere. I mean, he was a notorious ligger, as they say, someone that just dined off it. At one point, I think Wells spent 6 months away from home by coasting at other people's weekend parties.
Oh,
And
yeah,
just
anywhere for a free
party to
meal.
party to party to party to party for 6 months. So he was a notorious figure for doing that sort of thing. But yeah, no, he never had an easy time, particularly at Tredegar House. He was always being, yeah, he was pursued by one very ardent female guest at one point as well.
Yeah, actually, there she is, actually.
Oh, is it?
The Marchesa Godi de Godio. Her
Oh,
name was
gosh.
Kay. She was English, but she became one of Mussolini's mistresses.
Yeah.
And yeah, Wells did actually say that she advanced on him on the lake.
Oh,
Well, she
yeah,
fell in the
yeah.
water. He always fell in the water.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had a bit of an odd time. Yeah.
Here's Evan in the gondolier on the lake at Tredegar House is Oliver Messel, the great set designer.
Oh,
And there he and Evan's quite happy with life as Viscount Tredegar, isn't he?
yes.
Lois is long gone, and Evan's
Yeah.
just enjoying himself,
Yeah.
frittering away the money to his heart's content. My favourite guest, however, isn't talked about very often. I mean, the list of the guests included Prince Paul of Greece, Prince Philip's first cousin, who became King of Greece, Ivan of Vello, Augustus John, the hard-drinking Welsh artist, Lady Cunard, and her daughter Nancy Cunard, who wanted to marry Evan at one point. Another woman who wanted to marry Evan at one point, Inez Holden, who
Oh,
became George Orwell's paramour, Hermione Badley. Does that name mean
oh,
anything?
yeah. Yeah,
She was
yes,
in Mary
yeah.
Poppins as the maid.
Yeah, famous actress, yeah.
Yeah, she was a friend of Evan. Gwen John, possibly more talented than her artist brother Augustus. Sir Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, the Japanese agent Lord Sempil, and William Randolph Hearst with a party from St. Donat's Castle, another one of our podcasts. Quite a lot there. And this Marchesa Casati, Luisa Casati, who demolished two Italian fortunes and had her own unfinished palace in Venice called the Palazzo Non Finito. Yeah. Who would gild her servants, had a cheetah on a lead. I mean, she was a living work of art.
Luisa I am a living work of art. It's the only quote of her. Apparently, she would walk around at night in the Square at San Marco, wearing nothing but a white fur, with two tall black footmen either side of her, dressed in gold loincloths, bearing aloft blazing torches, the sole purpose of which were to illuminate her.
Yeah.
She held the last carnival in Venice before the First World War, when it stopped, and then the carnival didn't come back until 1985. So she hosted the last carnival in Venice.
She was amazing. I mean, she was a lover of Gabriel D'Annunzio, of course, the famous Italian poet. And when she demolished the marriages, she came to Britain with her cat, utterly down on her luck. And Augustus John was a particular friend of Casati. When she turned up at Tredegar House, I think it's Eddie Marsh. Remember, we don't really use notes for this because it's supposed to be a chat. Eddie Marsh didn't name her in his autobiography, but you know it was her because he mentions the snakes around her neck.
Yeah.
That she had dark coal-like eyes. And she said, essentially, he said, I'm scared of Luisa Casati, and quite frankly, I hope she doesn't make it through the night.
Oh.
Harsh.
Little harsh, yeah.
Augustus John had the best description of Luisa Casati. He said the Marchesa Casati, who he wanted to stuff and put in a glass case, quite frankly, said she leapt on life like a panther and somewhat overshot it. She turned up at Tredegar with a snake around her neck. She used to have dinner parties with wax mannequins.
Oh, yeah.
She once met Aleister Crowley at South Audley Street, Evan and Lois's home. And apparently it's the only meeting the two notorious characters ever had. And they both spun around and at the same time said to each other, you.
Oh, good.
But we don't know what the argument was. We don't know the beef that Casati had with Crowley.
Yeah.
But all very fascinating.
Yeah.
Lois, unfortunately, died at the age of 37. She was never going to reach the age of her friend Barbara Cartland or Diana Mosley, was she,
No.
really?
No.
She died in Budapest of a right coronary occlusion, which was a heart attack. She was taking these slimming pills. She had to lose weight, go back on the stage. Typical Lois, everything to excess, stopped eating, carried on partying, carried on drinking, appeared to have a weak heart she didn't realize, and she was dead at 37.
Yeah.
Lois is gone.
Yeah.
Evan and Naps Allington flew to Vienna, where she was actually cremated in Vienna. No one was there during the cremation. It was very sad for such a great society figure.
It was sad, yeah.
And as they were coming back, Evan and Naps had an argument over the urn containing Lois's ashes.
Yeah.
Evan was going to pay for another seat, and Naps, her brother, said, no, Lois would never forgive us. So they had Lois declared as hand luggage.
Yeah, and they put her under the seat, yeah.
The urn was buried at Critchell.
Yeah.
In the Rose Garden. I like Lois. You know I like Lois.
Yes, I have a soft spot for Lois myself. So
he needs a new wife to be a hostess for all these parties. And at a party, we have a man he was particularly close with, Count Vorontsov Dashkov, otherwise known as Larry. And Larry's sister appears at Tredegar House, and by the wonderful name of Princess Olga Dolgoruki.
Yeah.
Or as the people of Newport later called her, Olga Dolga. I like to think it's a pity she wasn't from the Volga, because that's a limerick waiting to happen. To the shock of everybody, he does remarry. And in 1939 in Singapore, his first marriage to Lois lasted about an hour and a half. High altar mass with all the bells and whistles and the smoke. And Olga in Singapore, he was 44, she was 24, and it lasted 10 minutes.
Oh, gosh.
Some would argue the marriage might have lasted 10 minutes. As a reality, that might be harsh. There's Olga. She needed a step up in society, didn't she, Goff?
Yeah, the Dolgarukis were basically on their uppers. They'd fled the revolution. Her father, Prince Serge, had been very ill in North Africa, which is where they met with Evan, and Evan supported him through some expensive medical costs. So I think her brothers particularly saw this as Evan's friendship with her, because they were friends, as a way of them getting back into the aristocratic ladder and a more sort of, comfortable lifestyle. So she was nudged, I think, into marrying him. It was a marriage of convenience. It was a beard, as we say uncharitably nowadays. She was there to give something, to provide cover for Evan's lifestyle. Whether she knew that or not, I'm not entirely sure. It's a puzzle. But obviously when they get married, they suddenly discover that Evan is not as well off as he looked, and he's living on an allowance from the tax department. So they're great they obviously had a much better stable lifestyle. But no, it didn't work. I mean, I think Evan made it reasonably clear very shortly after the honeymoon, which was not very bit of a disaster, that he was not going to change his ways. And that was it. They separated within 3 months and lived in different parts of the house. And communicated only by notes.
They went for a long honeymoon to Bali, where Evan was a legend for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And by the time they got back, one source says that they were only communicating initially by notes put under the doorway, which was a little harsh. There's Olga with the Tatler, on the front of the Tatler, no less. And here they are, after that honeymoon, arriving back at Tredegar House. Those who know Tredegar House very well might spot these two white gargoyles. They are now at the top of the great staircase.
Oh, yes, they are. Yes. Oh, yes, they are.
But they used to be.
Yeah.
They bought Evan and Olga a telegram case, which is still at the house, isn't it? Silver case. In fact, we used it in some of the early murder mysteries, didn't we?
Yeah, they used to post the murder clue solutions in it, yeah.
There's Evan and Olga welcoming some tenants, some guests at Tredegar House. And could Olga fit in with the hard partying lifestyle of Evan? Of course she could.
Oh, well.
Of course she could. However, could she fit in with the fact that Evan had this duality of life? By the way, Noel Coward told a terrible story, which we will not repeat, a terrible joke about Evan disappointing Lois after the honeymoon back in 1928. So the chances of Evan getting the heir he wanted in 1939 is perhaps unlikely. And here we have Evan at Tredegar House. Evan is here in papal robes. He was a Knight of Malta. a Knight of the Constantinian Order of St. George, a Knight of the Holy Sepulchre, whatever was going from the Pope,
Yeah.
an oblate at Buckfast Abbey, and here he is with Archbishop of Cardiff, Dr.
Oh,
Mostyn,
yeah.
who once went up to Blue Boy the parrot and asked him how he was, and Blue Boy told the Archbishop exactly where to go. Evan apologized profusely, but the Archbishop had a great sense of humor, said, "Don't worry, I get the feeling a lot of people would like to say that to me. It's refreshing to hear it said out in the open for a change." But what we've also got here, we've got a man of the cloth, and in the corner here, his
Oh,
denim foots, known
yeah.
as the most expensive male prostitute in Europe. Well, the world, actually. He was American.
Oh, was he?
Ah.
You got to, you know, you got to give Evan points for moxie sometimes, haven't you?
Well, he does mix up his, mixed match parties.
Yeah, yeah. You often were. Yeah, we debating the other day whether actually the bishop knew or not, didn't we?
We don't know. We really don't know. I mean, Evan, as far as his occult background, which we'll talk about before we finish, this is going to be our longest video, but I think we should just lean into it, Goff.
All right then.
I think we should lean into it and just get it done, and people can dip in and out, can't they?
Yeah.
When war broke out, Evan became basically in command of the 3rd Monmouthshire Battalion of Home Guard, while his wife Olga was trained in nursing at the Royal Gwent Hospital. And here's Evan, military discipline.
Yeah.
Here he is. I always think it's far more John the Measurer, Sergeant Wilson than Arthur Lowe, Captain Mannering with Dad's Army. Evan used to smoke snuff. Used to take snuff, not smoke snuff, take snuff from a large bejeweled box, gave some to H.G. Wells, inevitably disastrous. H.G. Wells almost collapsed. But here he is. But you can't really win the war on your own, can you, if you're in charge of the Monmouthshire Home Guard Battalion? So Evan doesn't last too long with that. He does, in fact, move on. Let's actually see Evan and Olga during the war. Evan and Olga during the war. Evan turned up. His sergeant saw him once for a cricket match because the prettiest cricket pitch in Monmouthshire is now the car park.
Yeah.
At Tredegar House. And Evan was in mufti. And they said, "Well, what, my lord, why aren't you in uniform?" He said, "Well, I've been given a new job. I'm attached to the War Office for special duties. I've become a captain, acting major of the Royal Corps of Signals." And Evan had a new job, and that was basically in charge of carrier pigeons. And who better than Evan be in charge of carrier pigeons? He was also linked to MI14. And MI14's job was essentially to monitor Germany. So when Evans drop in these pigeons, they not only drop down in a little parachute so you can read the message. Do you know this, Goff? Each little pigeon, some of the little pigeons contained a spy-in kit your operative could pick up.
Oh, gosh, never.
Because MI14 was purely about keeping an eye on Germany.
Yeah.
So we don't know the extent of Evans' work, but he was clearly doing something.
Yeah.
Very interesting. However, sadly, it ended disastrously. You almost want to say well done, because Evans started off the war in a sleepy Home Guard battalion, ended up court-martialed.
Yeah.
You've got to really work, haven't you? You've got to really work to get court-martialed from Dad's army.
Yeah, yeah.
It was said that he was talking too much, took 2 girl guides around his office, the aptly named Wing House in Piccadilly, full of birds when Evan was there. But they made the wing collars there, hence the name. Lady Baden-Powell was sick of him and basically had him arrested. And he was court-martialed in 1943. And he got the best lawyer in the country, Sir Walter Monckton, who handled Edward VIII's abdication crisis. And essentially, in this bizarre pantomime of a court-martial, it's really almost something like Gilbert and Sullivan could have written.
Oh, gosh.
Evan was given a severe reprimand. Well, it didn't stop him a year later, in 1944, appearing at Eisenhower's HQ with a gold crucifix around his neck, talking about pigeons.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Yeah, this.
We will never get quite to the bottom of what went on with all of that. It's very, very, very peculiar.
So it's Olga, by the way. Olga moved from the Royal Gwent to London, and she was doing work at the Morgan Crucible Company at Pimlico, which Evan's friends say she was actually involved not in munitions, but into top secret research into the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, yes, peculiar.
What we do know as a fact is, years later, after the war, Olga had her skull cracked in the Russian sector of Berlin.
Yeah.
Don't know what she was doing there, but we do know she was carrying a revolver.
Yeah, I know. It's, again, another. What on earth was that about? What is a white Russian doing in Red Russian quarter of Berlin carrying a gun? Yeah, right. Bonkers.
The
Isn't it?
marriage was ultimately annulled in 1943,
Yeah.
but Olga must have retained some affection for Evan. Here he is dressed in his papal chamberlain's robes, with St. Peter's in the background and an angel rather than a parrot upon his shoulder. His Catholic faith was very important to Evan, as I said, Knight of Malta, all of these Catholic things. But there was another side to him, wasn't there, Goth?
Yes. This gentleman is Aleister Crowley, one of the most notorious occultists of the 20th century, particularly the early part of the 20th century. Evan was an exceptionally accomplished occultist. Now, for many years, we thought that it was presented as a sort of as a weekend dabbler in the occult. A lot of people dabbled in the occult between the wars. There was an upsurge in this type of supernatural encounter behavior, unexplained things like this, and there was an uptick in practice of occult rituals and things like this. And Evan became very, very interested in this at the first end of the First World War. And was a very major practitioner. He had a much bigger reputation across Europe in occult circles than he had in this country. It was kept very much under wraps over here. He's described as at one point being the Grand Master of the Black Mass in Paris, which is interesting. Not many papal chamberlains are actually practicing Satanists at that level. But he was also but referred to by Crowley at one stage as an adept of adepts. Someone who was essentially at the stage of occult practice, and he actually originated ritual. He didn't just follow prescribed ritual, he invented ritual himself. We have no real idea what he was up to. It's the cult, it's hidden, it's secluded. But we know that he had a thing about bones, a collection of bones. On one occasion, he's described by John Duke of Bedford, who had visited the house, and they have a séance in Evan's bedroom, where Evan, enters wearing the robes of a dead Egyptian witch and brandishing a witch's mummified hand, proceeds to cast a fortune as a firelight danced across the ceiling and an overheated room became icy cold and owls fluttered ever around the cornice. So there was certainly an air of theatricality about it when he was entertaining his guests when that came out. Crowley visited many, many times, particularly in later years. Crowley had here he is. He's in with Mrs. Sutherland, Evan's secretary. Crowley was a notorious character who was very, very successful at one point and then went down the pan slightly. He got kicked out of Italy by Mussolini for rumours of child sacrifice and things going on in an abbey called the Abbey of Thelema. But he said he didn't do it. So when he comes back, these rumours start spreading. So Crowley decided to sue someone who said it. And he won some money. They thought it was marvellous. So every time anybody said anything derogatory about Crowley, he sued them. But he kept losing the cases because he actually had done the things they said he'd done. At one point, one of the judges said, "You are a genuinely appalling man, Mr. Crowley." So by the time he's sort of at the end of this period, this is in the 40s period. In the 40s. Crowley is a reduced figure living in a boarding house on the south coast. But he comes here, particularly up in the aftermath of the courts martial, because Evan is apparently furious about this courts martial, and he summons Crowley to Tredegar House to perform a cursing ritual on his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Parks. Crowley's diaries exist for the period. He describes.
Do you want to hear them?
Yes, go on if you got them to hand, yeah.
We'll have quick. May 18th, 1943, Evan wrote, invited me to Tredegar Park. Thursday, June 17th, arrived Newport about 3, taxi to Tredegar Park. Tredegar put me in the oak room, the best in the house. Friday, June 18th, studied Tredegar's tarot book. Very curious and interesting. Saturday, June, this is not all of it. Saturday, June 19th, chess with Tredegar. Said he played for Oxford and England. Probably not. Sunday, June 20th, saw Tredegar's magic room. Far greater than I thought, and he did expect me to talk to Frida about it. My one idea was to get out before any harm could be done. Another entry says gloves off with Evan, whatever that means.
Yeah, it's very, very peculiar. Evan Crowley said that he did have one of the better equipped magic rooms that he'd seen. And this is what we think it may be. This is the receiving cellar in Tredegar House. It's capable of being shut off without interfering the flow of behavior of activity within the house. There's a wonderful little clue which pointed us in direction. It comes from a chap called Montague Summers, who was a writer on occult matters. A pretty appalling human being, Montague Summers. But he says that many a secret takes place between an interior door that is shielded by a Yale lock. Of course, the cellars in the house have Yale locks. So they shut up. They lock automatically behind whoever goes into them, and into this room particularly as well. There is some evidence one of the girls in the school remember going into there and moving boxes aside with the nuns when the school was there and seeing circles chalked onto the floor. And we know that Evan seemed to be involved in summoning. He loved to conjure up spirits, summon spirits. When he was training to be a monk, he broke into the Protestant cathedral in Rome with members of the British Diplomatic Corps to attempt to summon up the spirit of Shelley. What a scandal that would have been. Also, when Gwyneth died and he brought her back to Basil's church at Basilic, he would go up to there and attempt to conjure her to sort out what had happened as well. So he was into summoning and conjuring, and it seems to have taken place within this room as well.
Yeah, there are another couple of reasons for that. I'm told by an expert in this sort of thing that it had to be as close to the ground as possible. Unlike The Devil Rides Out the movie, you really couldn't do this sort of thing upstairs.
No.
So it's private. And also, of course, you've got the water source, Goff.
Yes, underneath that platform at the back is where the spring rises for Tredegar House. So you have a natural spring there. That is significant in charging crystals and various things like this and purification rituals. And of course, you've got the heads, those very pagan heads on there, the Wild Man of the Woods and the Green Man, which we think may have come from the shrine of St. Gladys. It's a possibility. So this is the major candidate for what may be Evan's magic room.
We can't be 100% certain.
He will never be.
One, we know there was a magic room in the house. Yeah. We know it impressed Crowley. And if you had to bet, the circumstantial evidence suggests this room, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're not sure, but it does suggest this.
But it is a major candidate.
Absolutely.
It's a big puzzle with this. You have to take Evan seriously about this. The thing that's wrong with a lot of what might be defined as fringe beliefs is that you have to understand that the people who petition them are every bit as convinced about what they're doing. It isn't a fraud. It isn't a game. It isn't a bit of fun. It's serious. He was exceptionally well read in the occult. He had a major occult library where he collected books on various subjects and things, and he did know what he was talking about and what he was up to, and was also respected by Crowley, which is astonishing, because Crowley didn't respect anybody. And there's a great mystery in a lot of Crowley's writings. He was a terrible name dropper who drops names left, right, and centre, particularly about people claiming to have nicked his ideas. The one person he doesn't mention is Evan, except in his private diaries, which are very, very clear and very, very solid. So it's why he keeps him out of it, who knows? But yeah, Crowley seems to treat him as, so we say, an equal, which in occult practice.
Adept of adepts.
That is pretty significant.
And the heir to Excalibur. So it gets all Arthurian. Remember, we started Arthurian with our first Tredegar House video with Origins. It all comes full circle. I think what we will do at some point is do a Tredegar House live stream, sort of sum up the 4 videos where you can join us and ask questions about any bit you think we should have talked more about.
Yeah.
If you have any questions. So we will talk about that. Evan, it became very sad. Oh, by the way, Evan did have the skeleton of what he thought was a witch from the Lanova estate called Meg Jenkins, who apparently after a few drinks, you might go to bed, especially his peach drink. That guaranteed more than the usual stars in the sky that night. Yeah. And you get into bed, you might turn over and find that Evan had put the human skeleton of Meg Jenkins in your bed next to you as a lamp. But Goff's right. He was obsessed with relics. He was obsessed with bones. And he was obsessed with death. And death was something he had to face. Because after Olga had gone and The war ended. He got a medal at the end of the war, by the way, which is unusual for someone who had been court-martialed.
Mm.
And Burgess and Blunt turned up at Tredegar House
Yeah,
post-war, which again is
great
very
puzzle.
interesting. But again, it's very complicated stuff going on. He became quite ill. I mean, it's like Indiana Jones and Errol Flynn. It's not the calendar, it's the mileage.
Mm.
He'd pushed his body to extremes and was always delicate with, tubercular from his young days as that poet. And Tredegar House became quite sad, and all the servants went and they didn't come back. So most of it was closed up with dust covers and
Mm.
darkness. And he only lived in the attic at the top of the house, and used one bit of the house, really. The rest
Yeah,
was, even the
one
great
court.
staircase was closed, and it
Yeah.
became quite sad. Ultimately, oh, by the way, this is where the friends disappeared and the leeches remained. Sybil Colfax of Colfax and Fowler would turn up and say, "Oh, Evan, I love those curtains." And Evan, always generous to a fault, would just give her the curtains.
Oh,
Up
gosh,
to the
no.
Queen Mary about it. A lot of the friends did disappear when the money started vanishing. He closed Tredegar House in 1946, then reopened it, and then closed it again in 1948.
Mm.
And he actually went to live at a house that Courtney had bought his mum, Honeywood House.
Oh, Honeywood House in Sussex, yeah.
That's right. It's on the Sussex-Surrey border. It's Oakwood Hill. It's now a retirement home.
Mm. Oh, is it?
And yeah, that's Honeywood House. And Evan's mum was still there. She outlived everyone, actually. She outlived her daughter, her husband, and her son.
Yeah.
She died in her early 80s, later in 1949. Evan had actually contracted pancreatic cancer. Maybe his lifestyle catching up with him. Never complained. He had horrible treatment for cancer at the Middlesex Hospital. You see him there, even in his last trip to Rome, and this is actually signed to Harry Ware, Rome 1949. That was his last trip to Rome. And he was spotted there by a young American writer by the name of Vidal, who couldn't believe this man was ordering people about and all the Italians obeyed him.
Yeah.
And so he put him in his first novel, The Judgment of Paris, as Lord Glenellan.
Oh, right.
1 minute, he's trying to put the King of Italy back on the throne. On the other page, he's trying to help out with the Communist Party. So even Gore Vidal couldn't work out Evan.
Yeah.
Lord Glenellan's chauffeur is called Evan Morgan in the book.
Oh, right. That's interesting.
Very thin in disguise.
Yeah.
Evan did contact Harry Ware, and he said, "I have found a piece of the True Cross in Rome." Not necessarily this visit.
Yeah.
We're very excited about it. And when he got back home, Harry Ware asked, "Well, where is it?" And Evan admitted that actually he'd got a bit drunk and left it in a Turkish bath.
Dear me.
Evan died in 1949 at the age of 55, when he was stricken with cancer at the Middlesex Hospital, and they knew there nothing else they could do with him. Evan said something interesting. He said, "Take me to Tredegar." He wanted to go back to Tredegar House and die where a lot of his ancestors had died, but he was too weak. A friend of his, Tony Mattei, took him to Honeywood House. It was closer. But he wasn't just that Mrs. Sutherland was there. They dismissed the staff. He only had a few days left to live. And Olga, of all things, nursed him in the ambulance and was with him when he died.
Yeah, met him off the plane. Yeah.
You can't imagine Lois doing that, can you?
No, but also it shows that the relationship between them returned to what it was, friendship. They were friends. They never should have married. But again, and she had a nursing experience from the war when she was nursing in Royal Gwent. So I mean, it's interesting how she does that, takes that role on for him.
The Viscount Tredegar, the second Viscount Tredegar, is dead at the age of 55 in 1949, and apparently there was a burning of his papers throughout the land.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot about Evan you didn't want to be connected with.
Quite.
Safer to burn the papers.
Yeah.
And his mother, Katherine, Lady Tredegar, hopefully she found some peace.
Yeah.
In her later days, she died later that year.
Oh, right. So she did live him a long time then.
No, not a long time, but she did outlive, all of them. Evan's uncle, Fred, took over then, Courtney's brother. And Uncle Fred was, you would describe him as a taciturn sort of person. He had a valet. He had a house in Upper Brook Street, and his valet's name was Cronin, and he just wouldn't talk to him. It was just silence constantly. And then one day, Cronin went in, and Uncle Fred, the fifth Lord Tredegar, said, "Cronin, I'm dying." Cronin was so surprised that Lord Tredegar had actually said something to him. He didn't know what to say. So after grasping for a while, he said, Very good, my lord. Things continued in the comfortable silence as ever. Uncle Fred was sharper than we think, though, because he knew that when Evan died, more enormous death duties hit the estate. Uncle Fred was 75, crippled with osteoarthritis. He said he called the government wolves.
Yeah. Pack of
Were out
wolves.
for him. Called his son Pinhead, so there's that as well.
Yeah.
But it was Pinhead who he decided to transfer the estates directly to, because if he died again, that would finish him off. So he retired to Upper Brook Street, died in 1954 at the age of 80, and his son John, who you see here with Avis, the sister we saw earlier on.
Yeah.
John Morgan eventually became the 6th Lord Tredegar. Avis was a close friend of Compton Mackenzie.
Oh, right. Oh, Whiskey Galore writer. Yeah,
Well,
right.
a letter survives from Compton Mackenzie to Avis, telling Avis the inspiration for Whiskey Galore.
Oh, really? Oh, gosh.
Yeah, so... so John had a decision to make, and it's basically after the death duties were paid that he decided essentially to sell up.
Yeah.
This is painted by Leonard Fuller, who was the art teacher of John. And John did sell up. Now, he had dinners. Lord Raglan, the old Lord Raglan, actually dined with John at Tredegar House in 1950. Lord Raglan, I gave a talk at the Reardon Smith Theatre, and the old Lord Raglan said to me, of course, the problem with John was he was a lovely chap, but I was never sure about his wife. A bit harsh.
Yeah.
Very harsh. I spoke to his wife. She seemed lovely.
Yeah, Mrs. York, as she was at the time.
Mrs. York, yeah. She had a habit of marrying millionaires, but good on her.
It's got
Died
to
in
4,
2000. So what John did was he sold up and essentially moved to Monte Carlo. In the old days, what was left of the Tredegar estate was 53,000 acres in South Wales at this point by the 1950s, and it would have gone to the Duke of Beaufort in the old days, the Herberts maybe, Lord Langattock of the Hendra. But in the 20th century, who did it go to? Eagle Star Insurance Company.
Yeah.
And here's John.
All for 3 mil.
And here's John with Mrs. York. Oh, not Mrs. York then. Lady Tredegar then. Mrs. Morgan then, of course.
Yeah.
At the end, this is Jack Vaughan, who was the stud groom. We had this great story with Courtney. He was the one that Courtney used to go for long rides with when he was ailing. Yeah. And they had a bucket. They had a bottle of brandy for each of them, and they would ride through Tredegar Park. And then one day they went through a bit of Tredegar Park, which hadn't been cut back to the branches. So Jack Vaughan was at the front, and there was a little guy. Yeah. And the branches were sailing over his head and hitting Courtney squarely in the forehead. Now, unfortunately, Courtney was blind and couldn't see the branches, and Jack Vaughan was deaf and couldn't hear Courtney crying out. By the time they got back to the mansion, Courtney Tredegar was practically concussed. He said, what a pair we are. I'm blind and you're stone deaf. It didn't end a nice way. I mean, members of the Tredegar estate were promised they could buy the freehold. But John was given an offer of the whole estate. He had to pay death duties. He wanted to get it all shot and done. And so he did. And sadly, it wasn't quite the Tredegar way of doing things. But he did sell up and move to Monte Carlo. But what would happen to the mansion? Well, John had an offer from the National Trust. If he paid them an endowment, the National Trust would take Tredegar House off their hands. But the Sisters of St. Joseph's offered to pay him a bit of money.
Oh, interesting.
John went to Lourdes. John, like Evan, they hated each other, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
John and Evan loathed each other.
Yeah.
John went to Lourdes for inspiration. I like to think there was a nun hiding behind a bush that said, sell it to the Catholics. Is what he did. And it became a Catholic. By the way, John died in 1962 at the age of 54. He didn't trust French doctors. He came back to the Middlesex Hospital, again, where Evan was treated for the early signs of cancer. They had an operation. It was a perfect success, except the patient died of septicemia. And why do we know this for a fact? Because we got this from Mrs. and Mr. York in 2000, when she told me lots of stories about John, how at one point he didn't quite have Evan's... he was very kind, John, with the stepchildren. And he had ice in his veins. His yacht, the Henry Morgan... Just going back a bit. His yacht, the Henry Morgan, got in serious trouble off Bermuda in the mid-1950s, and it might have gone down. And John simply said, Well, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to go down below decks for a sleep. Wake me when it's all over.
oh,
Then he bought another yacht, off, didn't he? What did he call that one?
the Henry Morgan.
Yeah, yeah.
Didn't want to waste a good title.
Why not? When he went to Jamaica, it made a Morgan returning to Jamaica. You
Yeah.
imagine, can't you?
Oh, right, yeah. I don't think when then some of the responses we've had from people from Jamaica about Henry, I don't think it would have been waved in quite so nicely.
Well, they're mixed, I find. John, however, was not that great when he met Charles de Gaulle. He basically turned into Inspector Clouseau and knocked drinks cabinet all over Charles de Gaulle when they were introduced. But he died in 1962. He went to Monaco. Went to Edinburgh first, but then he went to Monaco as a tax exile. And he died only at 54. And that was the end of the Morgans of Tredegar. The title Lord Tredegar no longer exists. Mrs. York, as she became, actually married a chemist at one point, became Lady Wharton. So that's Kevin Mabley brought into the story. She died in the year 2000. When I spoke to her, she was lovely. She hated Evan.
Yeah.
So it became a school. We see here the Assembly Hall. The ceiling collapsed by this point in the 50s.
Oh, yeah.
It was Assembly Hall, St. Joseph's. It became St. Joseph's Convent School in 1951. And in 1967, it became co-ed, didn't it?
Yes, part of the comprehensive system.
I like to think the fact that, oh, by the way, it's a mirror there because one of the teachers did not like the mythical painting.
Yeah.
So they cut it out. Apparently gave it back to John because it appeared at an auction house not so long ago, and our friend Sue tracked it down, if you remember.
Well, apparently the nuns approached John the idea of selling it, and John said, "No, I'll have that." Took it off and sold it himself.
But clearly John did, Clearly John did keep certain portraits. He said, "Well, you can make it as a school, but I want the side hall at least kept with Morgan portraits, so I know my family is still here." And you can see peering at them. It's perhaps not the best example for young girls.
Oh, God, yeah, but as
Evan,
Papal Chamberlain. Yeah,
it was said that Father Maloney at Mays Glass was the busiest priest in the country because he was Evan's confessor. And I just wanted to show this.
There's another little thing about this just before we leave the school, is that, as you say, John and Evan hated each other. And one of the things Evan didn't want the house to become, he hoped that it would remain a family home, and he didn't want it to become either a hotel or a school. So John sold it to a school. I mean, that is interesting.
I think the Catholic part of it might have sold Evan on it, but you're quite right. What isn't here now, they use this for tennis courts. What isn't here now are the garages, as you can see here.
Oh, of course, yes, they've gone,
Yeah, Courtney had impressive cars there. Evan had a Rolls Royce, which genuinely did have a drinks cabinet in the back, but that was the standard. But also an altar.
Oh, yeah.
And you could go around Rome with his handsome chauffeur.
Yeah.
But yeah, those were knocked down, I think, in the 1970s, maybe early 80s.
Yeah, they gone by the time we got to the house.
Yeah, they were heated, so it was never too cold in the morning.
Oh.
Now, 1968. St. Joseph's School have a fete, and who opened it? But Olga.
Oh, gosh, she's back. Yeah.
She came back. She wanted to have a little didn't tell anyone she was there. She just wandered around the lake. But Sister Pauline, I think, in the house, realized she was there and insisted she came in. So this is, and she called herself Viscountess Tredegar, despite the annulment, to her dying day.
Oh, yeah. She was the last person to bear the title of,
In 1974, the nuns moved out to a purpose-based school. This is a view just before the motorway was built.
Oh, God, yeah.
So the gates are in bad shape, so they've been taken away. You've got the fountain is still here. And Newport Council took over, didn't they, in 1974 and restored it right the way up until 2012. Olga helped with the restoration, didn't she?
Yes, she wrote several letters describing the red room and the blue room, particularly, and detailing the furniture that was in it, and she would answer questions and queries that were sent to her as much as she could. Again, she didn't. The relationship with Evan was sort of slightly, remote in some respects, even though they clearly had a strong connection. So she didn't seem to know, and she could answer an awful lot of things about Evan's life. She knew the basics as it intersected with hers, and that's about it.
She said she never knew what was fact or fiction from Evan. But she said an odd thing. If you remember, Goff, we won't go into this because we will finish now, I promise you. Well done for keeping with us to this point. She did say, someone suggested that Evan, and David Beavers, I think this was, a curator who ended up running Heritage in Brighton, very talented man. He'd heard from someone that Evan had some mission with the Soviet Union. Bizarre, I know.
Oh, yeah.
Olga was asked this outright. And instead of saying, oh, that's ridiculous, don't be silly and laughing it off, she said,
Yeah.
well, I don't think my husband could speak Russian.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this
Interesting.
is another thread of Evan,
This
which
is
is
another
getting
thread. One
too
day,
much
one
to
day.
pull on. One day we'll get there. We may do a bonus episode one day on this. And here we are today.
2012, the National Trust took over the care of the house, although it's still owned by the Newport Council. It's on a 50-year lease. It's the best of all possible worlds, really. New roof, put on by the National Trust.
Yep.
And there we are. We have brought Tredegar House up somehow, slightly breathlessly, to now.
Ta-da!
Done.
We ran at it. We did it.
We did it somehow.
Have completed it all.
Do have any questions, do put them in the comments below. We may well do a relaxed Tredegar House live stream at some point in the past, but the next time we're appearing off is our usual annual review of the year, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we're debating whether we're going to do it live stream, so we might hopefully do a little live stream of our review of the year. So do come along and see us. We'll do it in January, and we'll let you all know in advance. Anybody who, if you like us, click and subscribe, and then we'll get the information out to you as well, and put up information on our Facebook page and distribute it around. So do come and see us in January if we do decide to do a live stream. If not, we will do our review of the year and have a giggle.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. And thank you for sticking with us. If you got through this in one sitting, you deserve some kind of medal.
Yeah.
If you didn't, thanks for sticking with us and getting this far. We will be back soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, right. Bye-bye.